Chapter 894. Lord Vero, all the jewelry here is made by Master Dillon. Look, the quality of the gems. In a luxurious and resplendent shop by the street, a few people of extraordinary bearing were casually inspecting the jewelry inside. The light of the gems was reflected by the mirrors on the wall, dazzling the eyes. Vero looked around casually. Although the jewelry here was claimed to be made by Master Dillon, how many of them were actually made by him? But even a single piece was enough to attract the attention of many rich people. As the few people looked around, they did not notice a handsome man and beautiful woman slowly walking past them. Whoosh. The sound of something cutting through the air rang out. The expression of a burly young man standing beside Vero suddenly changed. He quickly turned around and raised his hand, only to feel a chill in his crotch. It was as if a gust of wind had brushed past him. His face turned even paler, but soon, he heard a scream behind him. He quickly turned around and saw that Lord Vero, who had been choosing a crystal pendant by the counter, had fallen to the ground and was moaning in pain. Assassin! The burly young man's heart went cold. This place was very close to the Rose Manor. Who would dare ambush him here? He did not care so much and quickly activated his demon body, turning into a humanoid lizard monster in the blink of an eye. He stood on the spot, a long, pointed lizard head sticking out its tongue. Although the outline of his face was human, it did not give off a familiar feeling. Instead, it was even more frightening. A woman's scream rang out in the jewelry shop. Everyone quickly distanced themselves from the burly young man, some even turning around and running out of the shop. The guards outside the shop heard the commotion and hurried over. The scene immediately became chaotic. The people outside the street heard the commotion inside and were afraid of getting into trouble, so they quickly stepped aside and retreated to the side of the road. The burly young man narrowed his eyes. Ignoring the disdainful and frightened gazes around him, he quickly scanned the crowd, looking for the assassin who had ambushed him. Just then, the guards of the shop arrived, as did the experts behind the shop. They came to Vero's side and saw that his right knee was bleeding profusely. One of them quickly helped him stop the bleeding and examined the injury. Soon, a copper coin was found in Vero's knee. It was this copper coin that had pierced through Vero's knee and was embedded inside. Seeing that there was no poison on the coin, the expert heaved a sigh of relief and immediately ordered his men to send Vero for treatment. On the street, Dean held Aisha's hand and continued to stroll as if nothing had happened. He felt that he was very merciful and didn't directly take his life. He took advantage of the situation and attacked. As for what happened after that, he did not pay attention to it. He was too lazy to care. Such a small character should be taught a lesson. He did not want his mood to be ruined by such a small character. It was a rare leisure time. Dean took Aisha to visit various shops and some famous scenery in the capital, such as a fountain square, a crystal garden, and so on. He found that the physical consumption of shopping was not inferior to fighting. He couldn't help but smile bitterly in his heart. He looked at Aisha, who was still as quiet as a virgin, and sighed in his heart. But soon he cheered up and said, "We bought a lot of things today. Let's go back. Those 2 sets of clothes should fit you very well. Let's go back and change them. What do you think?" Aisha's expression was calm and indifferent. Dean slightly pursed his lips and led her back to the Rose Manor. On the way back, he heard the lords talking about Vero being injured by a sneak attack. But for the time being, they had not found out who the murderer was. But some people guessed that the other abyss got the news and came to warn them. Because of Vero's injury, the manor was filled with a tense atmosphere. Dean didn't expect that his casual lesson would cause such a reaction. But he didn't care. He went back to his room and closed the door. He took out the jewelry and snacks he bought from the bag and piled them on the table. He handed them to Aisha one by one. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. The lords of the manor began to gather at the training ground behind Rose Manor, including the injured Lord Vero. He was limping, his leg wrapped in white bandages, and he was using crutches. However, the number of guards around him had increased from 1 to 3. This scene was seen by a few lords who weren't on good terms with him, and they couldn't help but snicker. Some even went up to him and teased him, causing Vero's face to darken. "Lords, please send your elites to register." After the greetings, Hikari went straight to the subject. At this time, the other lords whispered a few words to the guards around them. The guards stood up and went forward to line up for registration. "Mr. Dean." Lozic glanced at Aisha. He didn't expect Dean to bring her on such an occasion. He hesitated for a moment. "Both of us will participate in your name," Dean said directly. Then he took Aisha to register. In addition to the names on the registration form, they were required to write their respective magic marks. According to Hikari, this form would be handed over to Mr. Holland for inspection. Through the magic marks ability of everyone, it would be easy to assign responsibilities. Dean slightly thought for a moment and wrote the name 100 Decapitator for his magic mark. This was the name of a legendary monster. Its ability was similar to Splitter. It was also good at attack type, but it didn't have the ability to fly. Its shortcomings were also very obvious. It was ranked behind the 20th monster. As for Aisha's magic mark, Dean also wrote a name for it. It was also an attack-type monster. In this way, it wouldn't be separated from Aisha when the responsibilities were assigned. After everyone had registered, Hikari looked at the crowd and said, "I have good news. Today, Mr. Holland will come to the scene." Wow! The crowd was boiling. Many lords exclaimed, and then their faces were full of excitement and excitement. Dean returned to Lozic's side and sat down. Losini and Loya, who were on the other side of Lozic, knew that Dean would represent their family. Their attitude towards Dean became much friendlier, especially Losini. Although she still didn't like Dean, but on the surface she no longer looked at Dean. "Mr. Holland is actually coming. Gee, the last time I saw Mr. Holland was when he was crowned Grand Duke William," the lords whispered to each other. At this moment, Hikari suddenly sensed something and looked up. Suddenly, she saw 2 black shadows appear in the sky, elongated under the sunlight, flashing over everyone's heads. Soon, someone noticed them and let out a cry of surprise. Then, everyone looked up, and the cries of surprise suddenly became louder. "Oh my God! Miss Monica is also coming. How come she is coming?" everyone exclaimed. All the lords couldn't help but stand up. No one dared to sit. Dean felt a burst of depression in his heart when he saw the 2 appear. This feeling was like a dense space was suddenly crowded with things. It made people feel depressed. He retracted his gaze as he didn't want to attract attention. Monica, who looked to be in her early 20s, suddenly looked down at the crowd. There was some surprise on her face. Holland, who was next to her, chuckled as he saw her appearance. "What's wrong? It's a bit strange, huh?" As soon as Monica said this, she was even more surprised. She looked at a woman wearing a purple veil in the crowd. "Undead? How is it possible?" "Undead." Holland was still very sensitive to these 2 words. His face slightly changed as he followed her gaze. "It is indeed the smell of undead." Dean knew that Aisha was exposed when he saw the 2 people looking at him. He sighed in his heart. The sensitivity of the abyss couldn't be ignored. He was just trying to hide it, but now it seemed that he was being whimsical. Dean was a bit frustrated as he thought about the last time outside the giant wall where the abyss saw through Aisha's identity. However, he and Aisha were inseparable. Since he was seen through, he couldn't pretend to be a pig to eat the tiger. However, he didn't care. At worst, he would just cooperate with them and suffer a little more. Monica and Holland whispered a few words while Dean was thinking. The 2 slowly landed next to Hikari. "Mr. Holland, Miss Monica." Hikari looked at Monica. There was a trace of surprise on his face. He didn't expect her to come. Horani smiled gently and said, Miss Monica wishes to travel together. Everyone, please don't take offense. Is everyone here? Everyone is here. Hikari replied. Chapter 895. Undead. Everyone was surprised as they looked in the direction of Dean. They saw the woman sitting quietly next to him. She was motionless. They felt a trace of strange and inexplicable chill. Since it was Holly who asked, it was obviously not a simple question. 7 or 8 lords who were sitting around Dean hurriedly got up. Some of them were in a hurry and almost tripped over the legs of the chair. Nevertheless, no one laughed at them. They looked at Dean and his female companion in bewilderment. Undead. Lozic, who was sitting next to Dean, was so scared that he almost fell on the grass. He looked at Dean in horror, but he saw that Dean was calm, as if he didn't want to explain anything. Lozic wanted to get up and stay away from Dean, but he was afraid that he would anger Dean. He froze in place, and his hair stood on end. What is her identity? Do I need to answer you? Dean calmly looked at Holly. You only need to know that she is my female companion. Holly slightly raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect Dean to have such a big tone. But he thought of Monica's words and Dean's attitude and tone at the moment. It was obvious that Dean acquiesced to the fact that his female companion was an undead. He didn't defend himself. Secondly, he didn't seem to be afraid of the fact that Holly would capture him. His confident attitude coupled with Monica's speculation made Holly's eyes narrow. He knew that Monica's guess was most likely to be true. However, he was from the abyss. It was a bit self-deceiving to think that Holly could scare him with his attitude alone. Holly glanced at the surrounding lords. He quietly looked at Dean. Are you from here? Dean indifferently said, Yes, I'm from another wall. Dean knew that he couldn't continue to hide his identity when Aisha's identity was exposed. But even if it was exposed, he wasn't worried about his own safety. The lords who wanted to scold Dean for his attitude choked as they heard Dean's words. They looked at Dean in shock. They didn't expect that a person from another world would be sitting next to them. Although the lords didn't like to leave the giant wall, but they knew how dangerous the environment outside the giant wall was. Wasn't he also a walker of the abyss if he could cross the giant wall to come here? While the lords were bewildered, Harani chuckled and said, I wonder what business your excellency has here? I'm just passing by. I heard that you know about the ice worm, so I want to inquire about it. In my opinion, you have gathered so many cannon fodder to help you explore the way outside the giant wall. Most probably you don't have a full grasp of the ice worm. How about we cooperate and whoever finds it will get it? Dean looked at Holly and Monica. He wasn't nervous at all. His confident appearance made Holland and Monica frown. They were 2 abyss experts while Dean was alone. He dared to be so arrogant in a 1 versus 2 situation. Moreover, they felt that since Dean was able to come to the banquet, he had some understanding of the situation inside the giant wall. At least he knew that the Wall Lord wasn't present yet. They had 3 abyss experts on their side. However, looking at Dean's appearance, it seemed that he didn't care. Was it because of his magic marks that he was good at escaping? Or was his strength beyond that of the abyss? Thinking of these 2 points, Harani and Monica's expressions became a bit more serious. If it was the first kind, then it would be fine. He was good at escaping, but not necessarily good at fighting. At most, he could only disgust people. But if it was the second kind, then it would be very difficult to deal with. Thinking of this, the 2 of them looked at each other and communicated with their eyes for a while. Monica shook her head slightly and signaled with her eyes. Holly saw the trace of softness in her eyes and sighed in his heart. He wanted to test Dean, but Monica refused to cooperate because there were many lords present. If they suddenly attacked Dean, it would be too big of a movement. It was inevitable that the lords would be affected. Once these lords died, there would be chaos in their territories. The chaos of war would bring a lot of innocent civilian casualties. Holly didn't care about these. Usually he would think about it, but in this special situation he was too lazy to care about it. Monica didn't want him to act alone. If Dean was the second possibility, then he would suffer a big loss. Since you know the news, then I have nothing to say. But we found this thing first. Why should we cooperate with you? Holly's eyes were gloomy as he said in a cold voice. The surrounding lords were the overlords of their territories. They were shocked when they saw Holly's reaction. They couldn't help but turn to look at Dean. But the next moment Dean's words made the lords go into an uproar. I'm also an abyss. Since I know about this thing, then there is no reason to give up. At least you two can't make me give up even if the Wall Lord comes. Dean said calmly, but his tone was very big. Although he hadn't fought against the abyss, but he was confident that he wouldn't lose much. He was sure that the relationship between the three abyss wasn't that close. It was impossible for them to form an alliance to fight against him. After all, the ice worm was just a piece of news. They hadn't found the real thing yet, so it was hard to say whether they could get it or not. He is an abyss? Lozic was shocked as he looked at Dean. He felt that he had overestimated Dean, but he didn't expect that Dean was also an abyss. His identity was as noble as Holly's. The other lords around them were also dumbfounded, subconsciously moving away from them. Luosini and Loya were still sitting next to Dean with their father. But at the moment their pretty faces were full of astonishment. Although they hadn't participated in the territory's governance, but at least they knew who the ruler of this world was. Especially Luosini. Her face turned from red to white as she thought of the words she had said to Dean. She was so scared that she broke into a cold sweat. So what if he is an abyss? Don't forget that both of us are abyss. Do you think you can win against two of us? Holly sneered. Dean glanced at him and said, Is that so? Why haven't the two of you made a move? Are you afraid of affecting the other lords, or are you not sure? Or are you not willing to fight alone to avoid getting injured? Since you've noticed my female companion, then you should know whether I'm fighting one against two. In my opinion, if either of you were to team up with me, it would be the strongest alliance here. How about it? Do you want to consider it? Holly and Monica's face slightly changed as they heard Dean's words. They glanced at Aisha next to them and their eyes flashed. Although they didn't know how Dean could make an undead so obedient. But they knew the characteristics of an undead. If a strong abyss was willing to cultivate an undead, then the power of an undead would be beyond their imagination. Both of their hearts trembled as they thought of this. Holly's face changed for a moment. You want to provoke us? Your method is too clumsy. No matter which one of us cooperates with you, we will be defeated by you in the end. It doesn't matter if the method is clumsy as long as the conditions are not bad. Dean chuckled. I won't force the two of you. You can join me at any time if you are interested. Especially Mr. Holly. I'm very optimistic about you. After all, the news about the ice worm was found by your hunting group. You know the situation in more detail. Anyway, I think we can discuss about the partnership. How about it? Chapter 896. Holland and Monica looked calm, but their hearts were filled with anger. Yes, as Dean said, the provocation was very clumsy, but the conditions given by Dean were not clumsy. Now they were basically sure that Dean was an abyss level. Plus the undead that was being controlled, it was possible that there were two abyss-level forces. Moreover, these two forces were controlled by the same will. But they were different. They couldn't achieve 100% unity. If the other party secretly cooperated with Dean, then the search for the ice worm wouldn't be a problem. But if they used Dean to plan the layout of the giant wall, then it would be really terrible. The three-legged situation inside the giant wall had been formed for many years. Holland and Monica were close to each other. They knew that if one of them died, then the remaining one would be swallowed by the Wall Lord. But now there was an external force. Moreover, this force was stronger than them and could even compete with the Wall Lord. They knew that it was dangerous to cooperate with Dean, and it was impossible for them to agree. But they had to say that because of Dean's words they were on guard against each other. They were angry, but they didn't want to fight with Dean on the spot. This was the capital. Once they fought, then the damage would be incalculable. Moreover, it would benefit the Wall Lord. Holland said in a deep voice, "Don't talk about these things. As an intruder, you better leave as soon as possible. Don't forget that we are not the only ones here. You may not be able to get a good result if we fight to the death." Dean indifferently smiled. He said that he was an intruder to tell Monica that they were in the same camp and he wouldn't betray them. He also hoped that Monica wouldn't get confused. But he had expected it. "There are 3 of you, including the Wall Lord. If you don't want to cooperate with me, then I will cooperate with the Wall Lord and get rid of you. I don't know what the reward will be." The pupils of Holland and Monica shrank. Their faces exuded a bit of coldness. Monica's cheeks, which had always been quiet and gentle, were completely cold at this moment. "It is impossible for the Wall Lord to cooperate with you. Instead of cooperating with you, it is better to maintain our current situation. Don't think that you can provoke us. You have ulterior motives. How can the Wall Lord collude with outsiders to murder his own people?" "That's true." His attitude made Monica frown. Dean continued, "I don't plan to cooperate with the Wall Lord for the time being. I just want to get the ice worm. You 2 are just leading the way. Whoever gets it will get it. It's a fair thing. I'm the same as you, so I hope you won't give me face, right?" Holland and Monica were relieved when they saw that Dean didn't mention about cooperating with the Wall Lord. As for Dean's words, they didn't think that it was a big problem. Not to mention that there was an unfathomable undead beside Dean. Even if Dean was alone, he was qualified to join them. After thinking for a moment, Holland slowly said, "We need to discuss this matter. I will give you a reply tomorrow." Dean glanced at him. "Do you think I'm a fool? Moreover, do you think you are qualified to talk to me about conditions? Don't forget that this is your lair, not mine. Don't you think the Wall Lord will have a headache because of one? Oh no, 2 abyssal devils. Do you really want to force me to make the capital feel comfortable?" Their faces slightly changed as their eyes turned gloomy. Indeed, half of the reason why they were worried about Dean was because of this point. If they couldn't kill Dean on the spot, then Dean would be in the dark and they would be in the light. They could protect themselves, but they may not be able to protect the civilians inside the wall. Especially the forces under their faction and their own forces. In addition to these, they had wives, children, and parents. These relatives were their fetters. Although for both of them they might not be able to use their relatives to threaten the Wall Lord, but they knew that the Wall Lord would definitely bow his head. After all, if the Wall Lord's children were obliterated, then the Wall Lord's position would be a big problem. "Well, I promise you that we will set off now to look for the ice worm together. I will provide you with the clues." Holland thought for a moment and immediately agreed. His decisiveness was surprising. Monica tilted her head and looked at him. Her eyes flashed as she suddenly understood something. She didn't object but silently looked at Dean. "Smart. Saves time," Dean praised. "Gather everyone and get ready to go. If we don't hurry up and wait for the news to reach the ears of that person, who knows what will happen?" The corner of Herene's mouth trembled slightly, and he said indifferently, "You don't have to worry about that." He turned to the stunned Hikari and said, "Gather everyone at the south gate. The 3 of us will go there first." Hikari was stunned for a few seconds but responded, "Yes." After that, he glanced at Dean, who was not far away. His heart jumped twice. He didn't expect that there was an abyss expert lurking under his eyelids. It was as if there was a poisonous python entrenched in his bed. It made people feel cold. Wero, who was in the crowd, was scared. His face was pale as he thought about the words he had said yesterday. His heart was about to explode. Several lords who had a good relationship with him stayed away from him for fear of attracting Dean's attention. "How should I address you?" Horny turned to Dudian. "Dean." "Well, Mr. Dean, let's go first. We'll prepare at the south gate," Horny said. Dean nodded and led Aisha to get up. Holland and Monica didn't say much. They came over to communicate with the lords to appease their hearts. But Dean's previous words about gathering cannon fodder made them not want to say anything more. They just wanted to leave as soon as possible. He wasn't afraid of the lords reneging on their words. After all, everyone could see how bad their mood was at the moment. It was absolutely asking for trouble. The two of them flew up and went back the way they came. Dark mucus flowed out of the splitter on Dean's back, forming a brand on his back. Soon, the brand turned into a solid object. Two ferocious wings composed of countless blades stretched out, overturning the surrounding chairs. He grabbed Aisha and soared into the sky. Soon, he caught up with Horny and Monica, leaving behind a shocked expression on the faces of the lords. Chapter 897. Feeling that Dean was chasing after them, Holland and Monica's eyes swept over the ferocious wings on his back. Their eyes flashed slightly. Such magic wings were unique in their giant wall. It was obvious that they came from the giant wall where Dean was. "Mr. Dean, you passed by here. Where are you going? You might as well tell me. I'm also going to a place recently. Maybe we are going the same way." Holland faintly smiled after Dean caught up. Since he had agreed to cooperate with Dean, he wouldn't continue to keep a straight face. It would be more useful to take the opportunity to inquire about Dean's situation. "Where are you going? You might as well tell me. Maybe we are going the same way?" Dean looked indifferent as he repeated Holland's words almost verbatim. Holland's mouth slightly twitched. Mr. Dean is really not willing to suffer a little bit. "Same here." Dean glanced at the two. "Both of you don't seem to have magic marks from here, right? Why do you think so?" Holland chuckled. "Has Mr. Dean seen all the legendary magic marks here?" "No, but at least I have seen the supplicant and the spirit," Dean said. In fact, he hadn't seen the demonization state of these two magic marks after they were integrated into the human body. But he could speculate from their abilities that Holland and Monica didn't have these two magic marks. They were from the abyss. If they didn't use the strongest legendary magic marks of the wall, then Dean wouldn't be able to understand. Moreover, he knew that the abyss walkers could cross the giant wall and even go to the kingdom of God. It wasn't difficult to get non-local magic marks. After all, if they lived in the abyss and used local magic marks, then they would inevitably be targeted. Any magic mark had its weakness. But if they used legendary magic marks from other areas, then the ability was unknown. Most people wouldn't be able to target them. Holland raised his eyebrows as he knew the meaning of Dean's words. He didn't deny it. "Mr. Dean, if you are interested, we might as well exchange information about the magic marks. How about it?" "Okay." Dean quickly agreed. Horny stared at Dudian for a moment and laughed. "Forget it. It's boring to talk about these things." Dean shrugged slightly. The premise of exchanging information was trust. Both sides couldn't trust each other. This kind of exchange was obviously a joke. Only a fool would tell the other his real magic mark ability. "Mr. Dean, which giant wall do you come from? Maybe we are in the same camp?" Horny said to Dudian. "Really?" Dean's eyes flashed. "Same camp? Could it be that there will be an alliance between the giant wall?" At this time, he suddenly thought of Aristotle, who had gone to the divine kingdom. He suddenly came to a realization. If these wall lords went to the divine kingdom, they would naturally have the opportunity to meet and make friends there. There might even be great characters above them. Where there were people, there would be struggles and factions. This was a truth that had never changed since ancient times. Dudian asked, "What is it called here?" Horny helplessly said as he saw that Dean didn't take the initiative, "We are called Kegel Giant Wall. Kegel is the name of our god of war. It represents courage in the god of war family." There was a touch of pride on his face. Even though he was an abyss walker, it didn't prevent him from worshipping the god of war family. This belief was rooted in the depths of his soul since childhood. "Kegel," Dean murmured. He didn't doubt that Horny would lie to him. After all, this kind of thing could be casually asked by any lord. But he didn't care about it and ignored it. "Mr. Dean, it's your turn." Horny frowned as he saw Dean was silent. Dean recovered and said, "The place where I live is called China. The god of war who protects us is the dragon. So we call ourselves the descendants of the dragon. The spirit of the dragon is to strive for self-improvement, fight against all disasters, and constantly strive for self-improvement." "China? The god of war is called the dragon?" Horny was startled as he suspiciously looked at Dean. The name was a bit strange, as he had never heard of it, but he hadn't heard of the giant wall, so he couldn't judge whether Dean was lying or not. But looking at Dean's expression, it didn't seem like he was lying. "How is it? Are we allies?" Dean interrupted Horny's thoughts. He didn't want him to think about it. Horny shook his head. "I don't know. You have to ask the wall master." Dean didn't care. In fact, allies had to stand aside in front of the ice worm. At this time, the three of them had flown over the south gate of the king's city. Horny was the first to glide down, followed by Monica. They inadvertently pulled a little distance away from Dean. Although Monica's performance was very obscure, but Dean still felt it. He couldn't help but look at the woman's back. He narrowed his eyes as he had some thoughts in his mind. The next moment, he also landed on the south gate of the king's city. "Greetings, Mr. Horny." "Greetings, Miss Monica." The guards on the gate saw the two of them and quickly bowed to greet them. No one recognized Dean and Aisha, but they didn't dare to neglect them. After all, they were able to follow the two abyss masters. How could they be simple people? "Is everyone here?" Horny restored his calmness. There was a bit of majesty in his tone. One of them said, "Everyone is here." Horny narrowed his eyes as he looked forward. He was about to open his mouth to say something. Suddenly, his eyes moved. Monica, who was behind him, almost turned around at the same time. Whoosh! A figure quickly flew over and landed on the city wall. The surrounding guards were shocked as they saw the person. They hurriedly knelt down. "Greetings, wall master." Dean's eyes narrowed as he looked at the person who was 5 meters away from him. It was a middle-aged man with a beard. His skin was full of strength. His eyes were bright and his eyebrows were thick and broad. He was full of majesty. He looked at Aisha, who was next to him. There was a deep meaning in his eyes. He turned to Horny and Monica. "You don't have to be so polite. Who is this?" Horny didn't expect him to come in person. He was surprised but soon calmed down. He immediately introduced, "This is Mr. Dean from China's Wall." "China's Wall?" Barker looked at Dudian. "Mr. Dean, what brings you here?" Dean felt that his lie had been seen through. He calmly said, "I was just passing by and heard the news about the ice worm, so I came to inquire about it. After all, the Wall Lord won't believe me even if I give up on it. It would be better for us to work together and overcome the difficulties first. Whoever gets it will get it." Barker's eyes flickered slightly and he nodded. "That's true. Treasures belong to those who are capable. Moreover, the extreme ice worm is in the swamp magic pit. Having an expert like Mr. Dean is also an additional layer of protection. I have no objections. Horny, do you two agree?" Horny replied, "We naturally agree. It will be easier to do things if Mr. Dean joins us." Barker nodded. "In that case, let's set off early." "We?" Horny and Monica were startled. Their faces slightly changed but soon returned to normal. Horny nodded. "Yes, but there are still some people who haven't gathered yet. Wall Master, please wait for a moment." Barker nodded. Monica suddenly said, "Wall Lord, if you go with us, wouldn't it be too dangerous? If something happens, we will need you to stay here." Barker glanced at her, and his expression became much gentler as he said, "I've already made arrangements. There's no need to worry." Monica's lips moved as she saw that Barker was so confident, but she didn't try to persuade him. Horley maintained a smile on the side, but in his heart he was cursing. Originally Barker wouldn't participate, but now he came over and didn't expel Dean. It was obvious that he intended to use Dean to weaken their strength. Chapter 898. Dean had a sense of crisis after the appearance of Barker, but Barker's appearance didn't surprise him too much. When he was exposed, he considered that he would face the joint attack of 3 Abyssal Masters. He even considered that there were hidden Abyssal Masters here. He was ready to face 4 Abyssal Masters at the same time. From the current situation, it seemed that Barker didn't intend to participate before. But now, because of Dean's existence, Dean wasn't sure what his purpose was. It was possible that he wanted to unite with Holland and Monica to deal with him, or there was another possibility that he wanted to use Dean's hand to get rid of these 2. Dean didn't continue to think about these possibilities. Plans were always better than changes, especially in a situation where the situation outside the giant wall was changing rapidly. Once he was weak, he would inevitably suffer a group attack. The only guarantee of safety was not to get injured. He slightly distanced himself from Barker, Horny, and Monica in case the 3 of them suddenly launched a sneak attack. Barker and the other 2 noticed Dean's movement, but didn't say anything. It was normal to have such concerns. If not, it would seem too confident and even stupid. After a moment, the masters gathered by Hikari arrived one after another. At this time, Dean saw that on the plains outside the south gate, there were hundreds of pioneer-level masters gathered there. At the same time, there were 8 rulers and 23 inner wilderness-level masters. Such a lineup completely crushed Sylvia's strength. Horny stepped forward to reorganize. After a moment, a team of nearly 500 pioneers was formed. 5 dominators, including Dean and Aisha, led the team. 17 dominators acted as deputies as they marched out of the giant wall. "Should we share the information about the ice worm now?" Dean said to Holland on the way. Monica and Barker's eyes flashed, but they didn't show it on the surface. It seemed that they didn't hear Dean's words. Holland glanced at them and smiled. "Of course. When we get to the giant wall, I will say it. It's not suitable to discuss here." Dean saw that he agreed, so he didn't say anything. In less than half an hour, everyone came to the giant wall. The rulers and pioneers who had the ability to fly took the lead to fly up the giant wall. They threw down ropes to guide the other pioneers. Dean, Barker, Horny, and others all had the ability to take off. They took the lead and climbed the giant wall. They stood at a height of 1 kilometer. The blue sky and white clouds above their heads seemed to be a lot closer to them. It made their hearts flutter. Holland came to the edge of the giant wall and took out a scroll from his arms. He spread it on the edge of the platform. It was a map. A strong wind blew past. Horny pressed his palm on the map and pointed to a place. "This is the outer edge of the Swamp Demon Pit, the southwest area. This is the trail of the extreme ice worm that my hunting team found." Dean didn't get too close in case they suddenly attacked. After all, they were at the same level of the same level. After all, they would have the same level. If they were attacked, they would inevitably be seriously injured or even lose their life. It was like 2 adults. The map was very detailed. It was the first time for Dean to see such a detailed map of the giant wall. First of all, the giant wall stood in the center of the map. It occupied less than 1/10 of the total map area. Around the giant wall, the terrain was divided by different colors. There were gray areas, light red areas, green areas, and so on. The place that Holland pointed to was a black area. There were a few white letters in the middle of the black area. They spelled out the meaning of the swamp. Dean's eyes swept the map. In addition to the swamp, he also wrote down other nearby areas. At this time, he looked at Barker and Monica. He suddenly said, "Wall Lord, you are the Lord of the Wall. You are far-sighted. Do you have any suggestions?" Barker wrinkled his eyebrows as he saw Dean's sudden attack. After all, Holland knows the most details. Let's listen to what he has to say first. Horny's expression changed slightly. He knew that Barkle also wanted to know the most detailed information from him. He snorted coldly in his heart, but on the surface, he was very calm. He said, "The traces of the extreme ice insects are at the edge of the swamp magic pit, and the extreme ice insects like Een and hate heat. Everyone knows this. The center of the swamp magic pit has the lowest temperature, so I think the extreme ice insects are likely to go there." Monica and Barker wrinkled their brows but didn't say anything. Dean pondered for a moment. "Does Mr. Horny have any good suggestions? As far as I know, the deeper we go the more dangerous it gets. Even if the 5 of us go together, it's hard to guarantee that there won't be any accidents. Do we have to force our way through?" Horny smiled indifferently and said, "Mr. Dean, you must be joking. It's impossible to force our way through. Even if we had twice the number of people, we would still be at a disadvantage. Let's go to the location of the extreme ice worm first and let Monica see if she can track the direction of the extreme ice worm. If she can find it, then we can follow the route of the extreme ice worm." Dean didn't speak but looked at Barker and Monica. To be honest, Holland's words were all nonsense. But at least he had revealed one piece of information. Monica's ability was related to tracking. 2 pieces of information were derived from this one piece of information. Barker and Holland weren't good at tracking. Tracking could be classified as a type of perception. If one wasn't good at perception, then they would be good at attack and defense. Barker saw that Dean didn't have any objection, so he looked at Monica. "Are you sure?" Monica slowly nodded. "Let's try." The decision was made. Everyone continued to set off. They crossed the giant wall and went all the way to the swamp. On the way, Dean asked Holland for the map. He looked at it several times and asked, "What are these areas?" Holland knew that Dean wasn't familiar with these situations, so he couldn't refuse. In fact, even if Dean asked a lord, he would know the information on the map. He was too lazy to hide it. They passed through 2 large areas. One was a gray area close to the giant wall. In this gray area, they met a lot of undeads and high-level monsters. Most of them were at the level of Limitless. Occasionally the weaker ones were at the level of Senior Hunters. Fortunately, the lowest level of the assembled team was Pioneer level. They crushed all the monsters along the way without any damage. After passing through the gray area, they came to a yellow area. The level of monsters here was obviously higher. Occasionally they would encounter the attacks of Pioneer-level monsters. Some of these monsters were good at hiding, some were lurking in the soil, some were camouflaged like a stone. Even Dean couldn't tell if they were real or fake. Of course, he didn't look carefully. He was saving his physical strength to prepare for the battle in the swamp. The monsters they encountered along the way were all seen through in advance by other rulers or demon generals. They were directly cleaned up. There were close to 500 people in the team, and there were many perception-type experts. Their perceptual abilities were also very strange. Some had special vision, some had special hearing, and some had mysterious senses that allowed them to sense danger. In front of such a mighty team, it was difficult for ordinary monsters to hide. After a long journey of 4 or 5 hours, they finally came to the swamp. Dean clearly felt that the atmosphere in the hunting team had calmed down. There were fewer whispers. As they approached the edge of the swamp, they met a demon general-level monster. It was like a giant undead. It directly attacked them and was killed by a ruler who was in the front. "Here we are," Holland said. He looked up at the lifeless land in front of him and the occasional concrete building wreckage. He whispered, "Pass down the order. Let everyone be vigilant and lurk forward." A devil general at the side immediately passed on his words. The dark golden light flashed in Dean's eyes. The radiation concentration in this area was far stronger than in other areas. Monsters loved to live in areas with high radiation concentration. Chapter 899. As Dean was looking around, Horny called out a team of 10 people led by a ruler. They took the lead to explore the swamp magic pit. 10 minutes later, the exploration team used a signal flare to send back information that they were safe. Horny waved his hand to let the team follow. Baker and Monica didn't have any objection. They gave full command to Horny. After all, Horny was the initiator of the operation. The intelligence came from his men, and the manpower was also gathered by Horny. Although Baker was the leader of the wall, he couldn't say anything at the moment. Moreover, the current situation was complicated. He wanted to spend more time on other places. As for Monica, she didn't like to stand out. As long as Horny didn't make a big command mistake, she didn't intend to say anything. Dean also didn't want to stand out. He wasn't familiar with the situation here. It was best to let them command. Therefore, the 5 people stepped into the swamp magic pit with Horny as the leader. Everyone be careful. This is a monster paradise. Most of the monsters here are at the level of 10,000 behead. There are even hundreds of monsters. Don't fall behind. Horny said to the ruler. The ruler immediately passed the message. Dean knew from the top-secret information collected by Aristotle that there was more than one magic pit outside the giant wall. However, the word swamp was added in front of the magic pit. He didn't see any swamp basin along the way. He couldn't help but ask Horny. The swamp magic pit is not an ordinary swamp, but a demonic swamp. It is said that there is an extremely terrifying demonic swamp monster in this magic pit. Its body is huge, and it can transform into a huge swamp. Anyone who steps into it will die without a doubt. Even abyssal people like you and I are no exception, so this place is called the Swamp Magic Pit. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect the name to come from this place. He thought that it was full of swamps and wetlands. However, the monster mentioned by Horny was more terrible than swamps and wetlands. What kind of size would it have to transform into a swamp? What kind of magical structure was it? Dean couldn't imagine it, but his mind couldn't help but think of the strange life-sucking trees in the Forest of Despair. Could it be that the monsters in the Forest of Despair were on the same level as the monsters in the Forest of Despair? Horny laughed as he saw Dudien's face change. Mr. Dean, you don't have to worry too much. The Devil's Pit is very big and the monsters like to appear on the south side of the pit. That area is low-lying and suitable for them to form a swamp basin. Generally we won't meet them unless our luck is really bad. But even if we meet them, the vanguard team in front will send back the information in time. We will have enough time to retreat. Dean slowly nodded. He still had the flesh and blood of the origami. He would be able to deter this thing and escape. Thinking of this, he glanced at Horny. You guys look so fearless. Could it be that you also have the flesh of the origami? Horny's heart jumped when he saw Dean's eyes. He was a bit surprised. Did Dean see what he was thinking? Was this the ability of his magic mark, similar to mind reading? Soon Horny rejected this idea. If Dean really had the ability to read minds, he wouldn't have reacted like this. Moreover, mind reading was too magical and couldn't explain the principle. In his view, all the magic mark abilities were based on biological changes, including the hallucination of the spirit. Although it sounded magical, there were many living beings in nature that had this kind of ability. It was a point that living beings could reach. But he didn't think that the magical abilities such as telekinesis and killing people didn't exist because no living beings had such abilities. It was beyond the scope of biological abilities and couldn't be explained. Dean didn't know that the man in front of him was thinking about some strange things. He glanced at him and then retracted his gaze. He turned his head as if nothing had happened and continued to move forward. What Horny said was right. This was indeed a monster paradise. Not long after Dean and others came in, they were ambushed by monsters one after another. In less than half an hour, more than a dozen pioneers were killed in the periphery of the main force. The vanguard team in front also disintegrated. Only the leader of the team escaped back with 2 giant pythons and chased after them. When the giant python rushed to the front, everyone saw that there were not 2 giant pythons, but a 2-headed python. It was huge and as thick as a tree trunk. It rushed all the way, crushing the new small trees. The old cement building foundation that collapsed in the green grass and soil was once again pressed down and even shattered. Ice and fire twin dragons. He didn't expect to encounter such a troublesome monster. He turned to look at Dudian. This is a level 280 monster. It's almost impossible for the Dominator to defeat it. We can only rely on ourselves. Dudian. It's a level 280 monster. It's almost impossible for the Dominator to defeat it. Dean noticed the word almost, which meant that the ruler could still defeat it. He said, a level 280 monster shouldn't require us to take action, right? He said it casually, but in his heart, he knew that it was a bit pretentious. A level 280 monster. This was the first time he had heard of such a high-level monster. He didn't know what level such a monster would be if it was converted to the human level. However, from Horony's words, he had a faint guess, so he said it to verify his thoughts. Horony saw that Dean was so arrogant, so he slightly smiled and said, although it's not level 300, the ice and fire dragons have special abilities. Their strength has been underestimated a lot. Even if we meet them, it will be very difficult to kill them. Especially the perception type of the abyss, we may not even be the opponent of this thing. Now we can only rely on ourselves to take action. If we hand it over to the other rulers, the loss will be too serious. It will cause too much movement and attract more terrible things. Horony is right. We can only rely on ourselves. Barker nodded. Monica glanced at Dean and said, Mr. Dean, we won't force you if you don't want to take action. Is that so? Then I won't make a move. Dean saw her goading and said indifferently. Monica frowned slightly, and a trace of anger flashed across her eyes. Her figure suddenly flew out, and her palm touched her loose skirt. She actually took out a sharp sword that flickered with silver light, and rushed towards the ice and fire twin dragons that were flying over. Horony and Barker didn't say anything and rushed up after her. Dean crossed his arms and watched from the spot. Horony said that it would be very difficult for the Abyss to deal with the monster alone. But if 3 Abyss Masters attacked together, it would be much easier. Soon, the 3 of them were engaged in a fierce battle with the ice and fire twin dragons. The 2 heads of the ice and fire twin dragons roared furiously and bit at the 3 of them. One head spat out a cold mist while the other spat out flames. Their abilities were exactly as their names suggested. Chapter 900. Dean found that the 3 of them didn't use their demonic forms. It seems that they didn't want him to know their demonic forms and abilities. However, the 3 of them cooperated with each other and soon suppressed the ice and fire twin dragons. Dean's heart was filled with regret. He hoped that the monsters would be able to make a comeback and at least force out something. Unfortunately, his hopes did not come true. Under the attacks of the 3 of them, the flaming snake head of the ice and fire twin dragons was quickly cut off. After dealing with one of the snake heads, the 3 of them worked together to attack the remaining snake head that was spitting out cold mist. In less than 2 to 3 minutes, they pierced through the head of the snake head and killed it with a single strike. Good! The spectators couldn't help but cheer in a low voice. Despite the suppression of their voices, the cheers of nearly 500 people were still relatively loud, scaring Horony and the other 2 who had just finished their battle. Horony glared at the people around him and quickly shouted in a low voice, "Silence." When they heard this, everyone stopped speaking resentfully. Monica frowned. She raised her silver sword and cut off the fangs of the ice and fire twin dragons. She buried them on the spot. She looked at Barker and Horony. "I have enough. The rest is yours." Horony smiled bitterly. Monica had taken the most valuable thing from the ice and fire twin dragons. The four fangs were excellent weapon materials that could be forged into weapons with the characteristics of flames and ice. Moreover, these weapons were dipped in poison that could paralyze the nervous system. If they were forged into weapons, they would definitely be a great weapon of mass destruction. Horny and Barker didn't say anything as they considered that Monica had contributed the most. Their demand for weapons was relatively low. It was related to their demonic forms. Once they were demonized, their arms would turn into beasts and they wouldn't be able to hold a sword. Unless the weapon was forged into a demonized form, it would be useless. Horny stepped forward and cut off a few scales from the snake's head and buried them on the spot. Barker wryly smiled. "You two have picked all the good ones. You're really cunning." Horny smiled. "Don't say that. Even if I gave it to you, you wouldn't like it. Monica's is more like it." Monica snapped. "Don't be stingy. Don't drag me into it." Barker smiled and said, "Forget it, let's get ready to set out." Horny nodded slightly. Previously, the cheers of the crowd were relatively loud, and it was inevitable that some monsters wandering nearby would be attracted. They had to evacuate this place cleanly. Dean didn't say anything as he saw the three divide up the prey. After all, he didn't contribute. Moreover, they buried the thing on the spot. It was obvious that they didn't care about it. It was just a dispensable thing and not a treasure. "Mr. Dean, do you want to go up and pick something?" Horny returned to Dean and smiled. Dudian indifferently replied, "No need." Monica glanced at him but said nothing. Everyone continued to move forward and soon, they encountered demonic creatures again. However, they were just a few pioneer-level demonic creatures, and they were easily killed by the vanguard team. Half an hour later, everyone finally arrived at the place where the extreme ice worm had appeared. Horny pointed to a snake-shaped slide mark in front of him and said, "Look, this is the trace left by the extreme ice worm." Dean, Barker and Monica didn't wait for Horny to say anything as they looked at the slide mark. The green grass around the slide mark was completely frozen, and the air was filled with a touch of moisture and fishy smell. Dean looked around. The moisture in the air was thick, and he was very familiar with the smell. It was the smell of the crystal wasteland worm. He was completely sure that what he had absorbed was the extreme ice worm. Monica and Barker were also looking around. After a moment, Monica nodded and said, "This smell is indeed the smell of the extreme ice worm. Judging from the concentration, it shouldn't have been more than 5 days since it left this place. Moreover, it seems to be in the molting stage, so it shouldn't have gone far." Barker was interested and asked, "How do you know that it is in the molting stage?" "Look carefully. There are wrinkles similar to scales in the slide mark." Monica pointed. Dean and Barker looked at the slide mark. On the surface, the slide mark was very smooth, but after a moment of concentration, they could see very subtle convex traces. Dean couldn't help but look at Monica. Was her perception related to her vision? But looking at her skills in the previous battle with the ice and fire twin dragons, her swordsmanship was sharp, and her figure was illusory. She wasn't inferior to Barker and Horny. Was she hiding something, or were they hiding something? Barker nodded as Dean was thinking, "Indeed, let's look around here. I hope it hasn't finished molting." "Okay." As Horny spoke, he turned to the ruler beside him and ordered, 10 people in a team. Organize 10 teams and search the surrounding 50 kilometers. "Yes." Horny said to Barker after the ruler passed down his words, "We shouldn't stay here for long. The smell will attract other things. We should leave as soon as possible and search ahead." "Okay." Everyone continued to move forward under the leadership of Horny. 10 squads with a total of 100 people spread out in the surroundings. Once they found the trace of the ice worm, they would send a signal. Horny looked at the yellow signal that was shot out from the ruins in front of them. At the same time, a red smoke bomb rose in the direction of 4:00. It was a danger warning signal, and also a signal to request for reinforcements. Horny's face slightly changed. He was about to send reinforcements but stop. There was a trace of gloominess in his eyes. Dean saw the change in Horony's expression. He asked knowingly, "The squad that went over there is in danger. Do we need reinforcements?" Barker shook his head slightly. "I don't think it is necessary. Horony's hearing should be the sharpest among us. It seems that the people there are in danger." Horony didn't care about exposing his ability. Monica and Barker already knew about it. Moreover, his sensitive hearing wasn't his main ability. He was good at attacking. His sensitive hearing was just incidental. So he didn't feel any threat from Dean. They should have met a big guy. They were all destroyed. "That thing has left?" Dean asked. "Aren't we going to avenge them?" Horony's face turned black. "The leader of the team is a ruler. Most of the monsters that can annihilate them are above level 300. Since it has left, we shouldn't provoke it." Oh, Dean didn't say anything. Chapter 901. They followed the tracks for 7 or 8 minutes before the tracks suddenly disappeared. Horony seemed to have expected this and said to Monica next to him, "My hunting group tracked it here and then there was no news. Can you see where it went?" Without waiting for him to ask, Monica had already used her ability to observe the tiny clues at the end of the slide mark. A moment later, she frowned and said in a low voice, "This thing seems to have been captured by something else." "Captured?" Holland and Barker's face changed. The next moment their eyes flashed as they stared at Monica. Barker said in a low voice, "Are you serious?" Monica knew what they were guessing, but she didn't care. She pointed to a spot in front of them and said, "There's some mucus left by something here. It's already dried so you can't smell it. This mucus has no smell, so it should be a monster that's very good at hiding. You can pry open the soil below and touch it." Horony gave the ruler next to him a look. The ruler understood and immediately went forward to pry open the place Monica was pointing at. He dug out a small hole and immediately felt a sticky sensation on his fingers. He turned around and returned to Horony's side. He nodded and said, "Sir, this soil is indeed strange. It's very wet." Holland stared at him. "Nonsense. Miss Monica said that there is monster's mucus. How can it not be wet?" The ruler was startled but quickly reacted. He bowed to Monica. "Miss Monica, this subordinate didn't mean to offend you. Please forgive me." "It's nothing." Monica looked indifferent. "The ice worm has fallen into the hands of the monster. It will be more difficult for us to find it. Do you have any countermeasures?" Holland and Barker looked at each other and pondered. Dean had long noticed the mucus in the soil. Although he was an offensive type, but his vision was excellent. He thought that Holland and Barker could also see it. He didn't expect that only Monica would notice it. He glanced at the three. "If the ice worm is found by the monster, will it be eaten?" The three turned to look at Dean. There was a trace of surprise in their eyes. Dean was puzzled by the three. He realized that he might have asked a question of common sense, but he didn't hide it anymore. He frowned. "What's wrong?" Horny smiled as he saw that Dean didn't know. "Mr. Dean, did you just become an Abyss member? The extreme ice insect is the ancestor of the parasitic soul worm. If the parasitic soul worm can live in a monster's body, then the extreme ice insect can too. Furthermore, it's much easier to invade than the parasitic soul worm. Even if this monster already has a parasitic soul worm, it can only give way to the extreme ice insect. Otherwise, it can only be eaten." Dean raised his eyebrows as he understood. No wonder the three were so surprised. In their opinion, this was basic common sense. As for Horony's words, he was too lazy to pay attention to it. Who told him to be an Abyss expert? So denying it now would make it more realistic. If the extreme ice worm enters the body of this monster, what use is there for us to capture it? Dean asked again. He didn't care if the question would show that he was ignorant. As long as he could get the answer he wanted, it was fine. After all, if they were to fight, he would have to rely on his own skills. Of course it's useful. Horny smiled but didn't explain to Dean why it was useful. Why? Dean continued to carry out the spirit of not being ashamed to ask questions. Horny was speechless, but since Dean asked, he didn't want to be vague. He said, "Generally, when the parasitic soul worm enters the monster's body, it will passively master the monster's ability. But the extreme ice worm is different. It can master the monster's ability, but at the critical time, it can also get rid of this ability and return to its own purity." Dean understood. He thought for a moment and didn't ask anything more. Monica and Barker looked at Dean. Their expressions were calm and didn't show any thoughts. "Monica, can you see the size and type of this monster?" Horny turned to Monica and asked. "It's not more than 10 meters tall. It's a reptile, cold-blooded creature. Like other cold-blooded monsters, it's good at hiding." "I don't know anything else," Monica said calmly. "Can you track its whereabouts?" Horny asked again. Monica gave him a look and said, "If I could find it, I would have said it earlier." "That's true. So, even you can't find the trace of this thing. This is a bit tricky. Do we have to rely on a carpet search?" Horny felt a headache coming on. If it were any other area, he could still spread out a large force to search. However, this was the magic swamp pit. Monsters above level 300 were very common, especially in the central area. There were even monsters that they couldn't resist, such as the demon swamp monsters. We can assume that the extreme ice bug has already taken control of this demon. The extreme ice bug likes low temperatures. If I remember correctly, there's an ice lake in the swamp magic pit. "It's very likely to go there," Buckle said. Horny glanced at him and said, "But that is the inner area of the swamp magic pit, close to the center, and there is an Arctic ice dragon living in the ice lake. The evaluation given by the Magic Kingdom Academy is 372. Even if the few of us work together, we may not be able to defeat it, let alone in the ice lake, which is its home ground." Barkle shook his head and said, "That's true, but don't forget how many people we have here. If we really encounter that thing, we only need to hold it back for a while and let the others fill up the frozen lake or evaporate it. It's like a bird with broken wings, and it might not be a match for us on land. Don't you have a list of these people's abilities? See how many of them have fire abilities or the ability to move rocks." Horny thought for a moment and looked at Monica and Dean. "What do you think?" Monica nodded and said, "Although the risk is a little high, it is indeed feasible. We can take this opportunity to kill this ice dragon. When we come here again in the future, we can avoid a huge hidden danger. If it stays here for too long and mutates again, it will be even more troublesome." "I don't care. I will listen to you," Dean also said. "Well, we will go to the ice lake according to the Wall's plan." Horny made a decision and immediately gave the order. At the same time, he recalled the 10 teams that were exploring the surroundings. However, at this moment, 3 of the 10 teams had already sent out danger signals. Most likely, they were in trouble. Horny was too lazy to mobilize others to help, so he directly abandoned them. This time, he had gathered so many people to act as pathfinders and cannon fodder. If they went to help the cannon fodder, then it would be more dangerous if they stayed here for a long time. After all, danger could happen at any time outside the giant wall. Moreover, the Devil's Pit was a dangerous area. It was possible to encounter more terrifying monsters if they stayed for more than a minute. There were 400 or 500 people gathered here, and the heat source was enough to alarm many monsters. Although most of them used items to cover up their aura, but it was hard to say whether they could hide from the perception of the abyss-level monsters. Horny's worries soon came true. Less than 3 minutes later, the vanguard squad in front of them broke out a deafening roar. Dean and others felt the ground tremble even though they were more than 10 miles away. The trees and weeds in the surroundings slightly tilted. Even the puddles on the side of the road rippled. A golden light flashed in Dean's eyes. His X-ray vision penetrated through the wreckage in front of him. He saw a huge rock monster crawling out of the ground more than 10 miles away. It was nearly 20 meters tall, and its structure was very similar to that of a human. It was a giant made of rock. Quartz monster. Monica's face slightly changed as she whispered. Horny and Barker's expressions also changed. They looked at each other, and Horny immediately made a decision. Finish this quickly, kill them. What is its level? Dean frowned. Chapter 902. Abyss level? Dean's heart shivered. Through the conversation with Horny and the others, he had a better understanding of the human strength corresponding to the hunting level. If it was more than 300, it should belong to the first level of the abyss, and that Arctic frost dragon had reached 372. It was undoubtedly an extremely strong level in the abyss. Quartz monster. This is the outer edge of the swamp magic pit. How could we encounter this thing? What should we do? The hunting group was in a panic. Although Horny's voice was low, the people present were pioneers and even the dominators of the inner wilderness. Their hearing was so sharp that they could hear a pin drop. In addition, there were many people with excellent vision or sensitive perception who could directly sense the situation in front of them. When the words quartz monster came out, it made people panic. Although there were 5 abyss-level masters present, but in front of them was a very strong abyss monster. Would the 5 abyss-level masters stand up for them, the cannon fodder? When Horny didn't hesitate to abandon the exploration teams, the hunting group was in danger. If it wasn't for Baker's presence, they would have already scattered and fled. Nevertheless, at this moment, most of them had already made up their minds. Once there was danger, they would save their lives first. As for whether they could return to the giant wall, and whether they would be chased by Baker after returning, they didn't care so much. It's too late to escape. Even if we can escape, they can't. Without them, we have to rely on ourselves to explore the way. Horny saw Dean frown and immediately said, "It's not difficult to kill it with the 4 of us plus your female companion. I don't believe that 1 against 5 can make it turn over the sky." Dean naturally knew this truth, so he said, "All right, but it's just an abyss monster. The 4 of us are enough." When the 3 saw that he didn't intend to let Aisha fight, they slightly frowned. Monica said, "If we want to fight quickly, it's better for the 5 of us to fight together. The bigger the noise, the worse it will be for us." "I know. Instead of being verbose here, I think it's better to fight immediately. I don't believe that the 4 of us can't deal with it," Dean said in a cold voice. Monica frowned and wanted to say something, but Baker interrupted. "In that case, let's go." Finished speaking, he leapt up and charged in the direction of the quartz demonic beast. In the blink of an eye, he had already flown 4 to 5 kilometers away. Seeing that he was trying to smooth things over and take the initiative to make a move, Horny didn't have much else to say. He ordered the ruler beside him to stand by and wait for orders, and then he followed. Dean ignored Monica and chased with Aisha. Although he didn't intend to let Aisha fight, but he was used to keeping her by his side. She could just watch the fight from the side. Dean saw that Baker and Horny were fighting with the quartz beast by the time he got close to the battlefield. They were fighting while retreating. It was obvious that they wanted to wait for Dean and Monica to come over to help them. Dean sneered in his heart as he saw that both of them didn't use their magic body. He didn't use his magic body either. He pulled out his splitter and rushed forward. He saw that the quartz demonic beast's body was petrified as if it was made of stone. However, it was impossible for a stone to mutate into a creature. It was most likely that the quartz demonic beast liked to eat stones, which led to its body being petrified. Dean rushed up and chopped its toes. The quartz beast that was attracted by Horny and Barkle roared. It looked down and waved its huge stone fist towards Dean. Dean's face slightly changed as he cursed in his heart. He immediately jumped back. The quartz demonic beast roared as it chased after Dean. It completely abandoned Harani and Baker. Dean was angry as he saw the situation. He had underestimated the shamelessness of these two. Although it seemed that they were restraining the court's demonic beast, they didn't cause any actual damage to it. On the contrary, he had casually cut the court's demonic beast and immediately pulled its hatred towards him. At this time, Monica also caught up. She froze for a moment as she saw the court's demonic beast chasing after Dean. However, she quickly understood and immediately rushed forward. Dean was a little relieved as he saw Monica rushing from behind. Although he didn't like this woman's mouth, but she was more simple than Baker and Harani. On the other hand, the two were anxiously chasing the court's demonic beast. However, they always kept a certain distance from it. It seemed that they couldn't catch up no matter what. Dean was very angry. He didn't lead the court's demonic beast to Monica. Instead, he suddenly stopped and then rushed forward. The court's demonic beast couldn't react in time. Dean took advantage of the situation and passed by its legs. The court's demonic beast turned its head and immediately met Harani and Baker, who were chasing in midair. Both of them didn't expect Dean to suddenly make such a move. Their faces suddenly changed. However, they couldn't pretend anymore as they were facing the court's demonic beast. They could only bite the bullet and continue to restrain it. Dean's face turned cold as he saw the two attack the court's demonic beast. He said, "If we don't solve this thing as soon as possible and attract other monsters, then we won't have a good fruit to eat. What's the point of acting too fake?" Dean's voice wasn't loud, but Harani and Baker could hear it clearly. Both of them were embarrassed. The next moment, Baker took the lead to say, "Brother Dean misunderstood. The skin of this court's demonic beast is thick. Although we attacked it with all our strength, but it didn't have much effect. It seems that we have to go all out and enter the demonic body to fight." Dean coldly snorted. "If that's the case, then what are we waiting for?" Harani gently smiled. The weapon in his hand quickly melted. In the blink of an eye, his body turned into a nearly 3 meters tall black bird. His head was protruding like a crow's head. His face was covered with feathers. Only a little of the original outline could be seen. He had 4 wings. They were as black as ink and had no feathers. If one looked closely, one could see that the inside of the wings was attached with sharp black needles. If one was hit by the wings or hugged by the wings, then it would inevitably cause terrible damage. Dean's eyes flashed as he saw the changes. He had never seen such a demonic body before. On the other side, Baker also entered the demonic body state. His body was like a human-shaped skeleton, but there was a pair of huge bone wings on his back. He looked like a devil that had returned from the underworld. His arms maintained the shape of a human skeleton's palm. He was holding the original dark bone sword. There was a thin black membrane between the ribs of his chest. The white ribs were protruding and extremely eye-catching. Dean had never seen such a demonic body before. He looked at Monica, who had also entered the demonic body state. Her body was like a dexterous moth. Her skin had turned pink like the putty powder on the wall. Her eyes were blood-red. Although the outline of her cheeks was still beautiful, but no one could raise the slightest evil thoughts. After entering the demonic body, the original appearance had changed. Dean's heart was touched. Both Harani and Monica were handsome men and beautiful women. But after entering the demonic body, they became evil and horrible like monsters. People didn't dare to get close to them. This was the fundamental reason why nobles discriminated against warriors. At this time, the 3 people who entered the demonic body also looked at Dean. Baker coughed. "Brother Dean, what are you doing?" Dean's face was cold. The splitter in his hand melted as he quickly entered the demonic body state. At the same time, he dodged the punch of the quartz beast. The sand and dust on the ground splashed as his body soared into the air. His body was covered with spikes and sharp blades. It seemed as if it was a mixture of countless sharp blades. His hideous demonic body floated in the air. The 3 people were stunned. There was a bit of shock and dignity in their eyes. Chapter 903. Brother Dean, looking at your demonic body, you should be the attack type. How about we pin down the quartz beast? Let the two of them outflank it from the side and end the battle quickly. Barker took a deep look at the demonized Dean. His face showed a smile as he said in a loud voice. Dean turned his head. In fact, he didn't need to turn his head to see Barker. He could clearly see the changes in the expressions of the three. But in order to cover it up, he said, "All right, but can the two of them hurt this thing?" Horny smiled as he saw Dean agree. "Mr. Dean, don't worry. Leave it to us." Dean looked at him but didn't say anything. Pinching the quartz beast from the front was undoubtedly the most dangerous. But in order to end the battle quickly, he didn't want to waste time. Moreover, Barker was also going to pin down the quartz beast. The strength of the abyss was much stronger than Horny and Monica. There wouldn't be any danger if the two of them helped. In fact, he felt that there wouldn't be any problem if he fought the beast alone. He was able to easily avoid the previous attacks of the quartz beast without entering his demonic body. If the quartz beast maintained its speed, then he felt that he could get close to it and tear it apart. He had the confidence to do so. After all, the split blade was able to hurt the toes of the quartz beast. Moreover, the demonized blade was even sharper after entering the beast's body. However, he didn't want to expose too many of his fighting methods in the presence of Barker and the other two. After all, sooner or later there would be a fierce battle after finding the ice worm. Roar! The quartz beast raised its fist and pounded its chest. It roared in anger as it rushed towards Dean and Barker. "I'll go up and you go down." Barker took the initiative to fly towards the shoulder of the quartz beast. The bone sword in his hand cut a deep groove. The petrified skin on the shoulder of the quartz beast seemed to feel pain. It roared and reached out to grab Barker. Dean didn't hesitate as he saw that Barker had attracted the attention of the quartz beast. He rushed towards its chest. Since Barker had taken the initiative to attack the upper body of the quartz beast and shared the main danger, Dean couldn't stay idle. He had to contribute a little bit of strength. Puff! The demonized blades on his body flung out, sweeping across the chest of the quartz magic beast. Immediately, a few wounds appeared, as if it had been torn by a giant claw. Dean was surprised. In order not to attract attention, he only used 30% of his strength. He was mentally prepared to leave only a shallow mark. If it was only a shallow mark, then the beast may not notice him. So he didn't have to bear the anger of the quartz beast. However, he did not expect that just 30% of his strength would create a wound that was not inferior to the one Buckle's bone sword had created. It was even wider and deeper. Dean smiled wryly in his heart. He saw that the quartz beast had stopped. It looked down and once again issued an angry roar. It gave up on chasing Baker and raised its hand to slap at Dean. Dean quickly dodged. At the same time, he paid attention to Baker's figure. He didn't want Baker to take advantage of the chaos to launch a sneak attack. At the same time, he was looking for an opportunity to attack Baker. If he could get rid of one of them, the pressure on him would be greatly reduced. Even if their relationship broke up, he wouldn't have to worry about losing his life. Brother Dean, good job. No wonder you have the courage to cross the abyss. Baker saw that Dean had lured away the quartz beast. He was shocked to see the cracks on the chest of the quartz magic beast. He didn't expect Dean's attack power to be so terrifying. Although he didn't use his full strength when attacking the quartz magic beast, but he had figured out the defense of the quartz magic beast. Even he had to use his full strength to deal considerable damage. Naturally, he wouldn't make a move easily. He had used less than 70% of his strength in the previous attack. But now it seemed that the injuries caused by Dean were much bigger than his. This showed that Dean's attack power wasn't inferior to his. Dean didn't pay attention to Baker's address as Brother Dean. He gently gasped a few times and quickly suppressed his breathing. On the surface, he tried to maintain a calm appearance. Sir Wall-Lord is overpraising me. Let's deal with this thing first. Baker also knew that this wasn't the right time to talk. Otherwise, it would inevitably make others feel that he was too skillful. He glanced at Dean. He saw that Dean had stopped gasping for breath. His mouth slightly curved into a smile. He once again rushed towards the quartz magic beast. Roar! The quartz magic beast was ready to attack Dean. However, it saw Baker flying over. Previously, the human had injured its shoulder. The pain was unbearable. It didn't expect that the human would appear again. It roared and suddenly lifted its foot to stomp on the ground. Bang! The earth trembled and raised a lot of dust. Dean was about to wait for the dust to disperse before attacking again. But his eyelids suddenly jumped. He was aghast. He immediately dodged. Whoosh! A sharp rock pierced through his position. If he had dodged a little late, then he would have been injured even if he didn't die. Golden light flashed in Dean's eyes. His eyes pierced through the dust and instantly saw the surrounding scene. He couldn't help but be aghast. He saw dozens of sharp thorns protruding from the ground. These thorns grew out of the soil. It seemed that they were controlled by the quartz magic beast. What kind of ability is this? Dean was startled. He couldn't figure it out. The next moment, he felt his body was suddenly enveloped by an inexplicable force. It pulled his body towards the quartz magic beast. At the same time, the quartz magic beast's chest changed. A sharp stone horn protruded out. Dean's body flew towards this stone horn. What kind of power is this? Dean's eyes widened. There was a trace of panic in his heart. But after all, he had experienced many life and death situations. He quickly reacted and flapped his wings to break free from the strange force. He once again opened the distance between him and the quartz magic beast. On the other side, Baker's body flew straight towards the stone horn protruding from the quartz magic beast's shoulder. Baker suddenly waved his sword and the stone horn was cut off. Baker's feet stepped on the quartz magic beast's shoulder. He exerted his strength and flew in the opposite direction. Compared to Dean, who was fleeing, Baker seemed to be more skillful and at ease. He also took advantage of the momentum to counterattack the quartz magic beast. Dean looked thoughtful as he saw this scene. It seemed that the previous strange force was caused by the quartz magic beast. But what kind of ability was it to control the power from a distance? Was it mind control? Dean felt that it was unlikely. This kind of ability was too magical. He didn't dare to think about it. At this time, the ground suddenly fluctuated. Numerous stone alls flew out and shot towards the four people like raindrops. Dean was startled for a moment. Suddenly he understood. But in his heart, he was very surprised. Could it be that the quartz magic beast had displayed the same ability? If so, then he had probably guessed what its ability was. Magnetic force. Through its own magnetic field, it was able to control the surrounding magnetic field and gravitational changes. Moreover, from the current attack, it seemed that the quartz magic beast could only control stones. The reason why it was able to pull Dean over was because it could control stones. But it was controlling its own stones. Through its own gravitational force, it was able to pull Dean over. Dean suddenly felt that this seemingly clumsy quartz magic beast's fighting skills were simply art. Whoosh! He waved his sword and smashed the stone alls under his feet. At the same time, he looked behind the quartz magic beast. Horny and Monica were close behind it. The outcome of the battle would soon be revealed. At this time, bang! A light sound came from the rear. It was the sound of a signal flare. Dean had heard it several times before, so he was very familiar with the sound. He used the horn on top of his head to look behind him. He suddenly saw more than a dozen red warning signals in the air. The distance from the signal flare was the place where the main forces were staying. Chapter 904. He saw a blazing and exuberant heat source appear in the center of the large army. This heat source was like a hill. It was 10 meters high and oval in shape. The fiery red heat source was in sharp contrast to the heat sources of the surrounding warriors. It was like the difference between crimson and light pink. Even some of the more brightly colored dominators had lighter colors than this heat source. The density of the heat source was a bit stronger than the quartz beast in front of him. Another abyssal monster? Dean's mouth slightly twitched. Although he knew that the Devil's Pit was extremely dangerous and it was very likely to encounter abyss monsters, but he didn't expect to encounter 2 abyss monsters in the same place. It must be known that most of the monsters had a territory. It was almost impossible to have a second monster of the same rank in the same territory. This involved the competition for survival resources in the territory. It was intolerable. But the facts in front of him told him that nothing was impossible. It's an abyss monster. On the other side, Horony exclaimed. Apparently, he had also noticed the movement in the rear. Damn, how can we be so unlucky? Let's get rid of this one together. Otherwise it will be troublesome if the other one comes over. Buck roared as he raised his bone sword and rushed towards the quartz beast. Horony seemed to know that the situation was critical. He suddenly screamed and issued a harsh sound wave from his crow-like beak. His wings were full of thorns as he flapped them. His speed was twice as fast as before as he rushed towards the back of the quartz beast's neck. His ear-piercing scream immediately attracted the attention of the quartz beast, causing it to abandon its pursuit of Dean and Buck and turn around to pounce on Holland. Looking at the quartz beast that had suddenly turned around, Horony's expression changed. He wanted to stop his body, but after a pause, he once again rushed towards the quartz beast. This time, he was not in control of his own body, but was being pulled over. No! Horony roared as he frantically flapped his wings. But he still couldn't stop his body. The next moment, the quartz beast raised its palm to block the sun and fiercely swatted down from the top of Horony's head. Horony's face was full of shock and anger. Just as the stone palm was about to hit him, he suddenly stopped resisting and accelerated the flapping of his wings, instantly dodging the stone palm. His body was like a meteorite as he flew towards the quartz magic beast. This time, he could no longer stop. The quartz beast's reaction was also very fast. When Horony dodged its attack, sharp stone spikes quickly protruded from the surface of its chest. They were incomparably thick and could easily pierce through Horony. "Save me!" Horony couldn't help but shout. There was a trace of panic in his voice. However, Monica, who was the closest to him, was also more than 20 meters away from him. There was no time for her to help. All of this happened in a millisecond. Just as they were about to collide, Horony suddenly tilted his body and spread his 4 wings, changing the trajectory of the wind. His body flew in an upward arc, which allowed him to avoid the stone spikes on the chest of the quartz monster, but his destination was the mouth of the quartz monster. The quartz monster seemed to be clumsy, but its reaction was very fast. Just as Horony was about to fly over, it suddenly opened its bloody mouth and made a strange buzzing sound. The next moment, Horony had no time to stop, so he went straight into the mouth of the quartz monster and was swallowed. Dean's pupil shrank. Dean's pupil shrank. Was it eaten like this? Horony was a powerhouse of the abyss. How could he be so vulnerable? No, it wasn't that he was weak, but the quartz monster was too strong. "Beast, let go of me!" With a roar, Buck slashed the shoulder of the quartz monster. He had just arrived when he saw that Horony had been swallowed. At this moment, his face was full of resentment. If he had arrived half a second earlier, he would have been able to snatch Horony from the mouth of the quartz monster. There was a half-meter deep stone mark on the shoulder of the quartz monster. There was no blood, but it seemed to feel the pain. It issued a dull roar and swung its hands towards Buck. Buck didn't choose to resist. Comparing strength with the quartz monster was undoubtedly a weak point. He stepped on the shoulder of the quartz monster and borrowed the force to retreat. But just as he was flying halfway, his speed suddenly slowed down. It was as if he had suddenly fallen into a swamp. Buck's face changed greatly. He burst out with all his strength to flap his wings to break free from the binding force. But suddenly, his eyes darkened as two huge fists smashed down on him. Bang! Buck's body was like a cannonball that smashed into the ground under the feet of the quartz monster. The ground shook and a lot of dust splashed up. Buck's body was smashed more than 10 meters into the ground. It could be seen how terrifying the power of the punch was. Dean saw Buck's body through his X-ray vision. He wasn't dead, but 4 or 5 ribs on his chest were broken. He was dying. In the blink of an eye, one was swallowed by the abyss. It was unknown whether he was alive or dead, but the other was seriously injured. All of this happened so fast that Dean couldn't believe it. He had a feeling that it was unreal. Although he knew that monsters were much stronger when fighting with humans of the same level, but he didn't expect the difference to be so big. Roar! The quartz monster roared in anger. It lifted its foot and stomped on the place where Buck was buried. The ground shrank and squeezed Buck so much that he spat out a mouthful of blood. At this moment, Monica, who was like a white moth, suddenly appeared behind the quartz magical beast. The slender silver sword in her hand stabbed towards the quartz magical beast's head. With a whoosh, the silver sword sank into the quartz magical beast's head. When Monica tried to pull her sword back, she discovered that she couldn't move it. Her face slightly changed. She decisively abandoned the sword and quickly said to Dean, "Your attack is stronger than me. I will contain it while you attack. Let's end this quickly." She lightly flew towards the front of the quartz monster. The white skin on the surface of her hand squirmed and quickly formed a bow. She took out a golden arrow from the middle of the armor. This arrow was originally part of the armor. Dean didn't know that it could be disassembled until now. Monica aimed at the eyes of the quartz monster and shot the arrow. The eye sockets of the quartz monster were 2 black holes. The arrow went straight into the eye socket. The quartz monster suddenly roared in anger and pain. It covered its eyes with one hand and cried out a few times in pain. It immediately chased after Monica. Monica's figure fluttered like a nimble butterfly. She dodged the giant palm of the quartz monster. It seemed light but extremely dangerous. Dean didn't think about the crisis anymore. He couldn't continue to hide his strength. Otherwise, he would have to wait for the other abyss monster to come over. He might have to expose more cards in order to solve the problem. Whoosh! Dean rushed over from the side. This was the first time he used his full strength since he became an abyss monster. His body was like an afterimage. He was so fast that he couldn't adapt to it. The quartz monster seemed to be in a violent rage. It didn't pay attention to Dean's approach. Dean quickly caught up with it from the side. It didn't take him much effort. He flew to the side of the neck of the quartz monster. His eyes flashed as he swung the 4 sharpest blades on his back with all his strength. Puff, puff. The neck of the quartz monster was cut in an instant. The sharp blade on his back was 2 meters long and had cut across his body, creating a wound that was about 1.6 meters long. It had sliced through half of the quartz magical beast's neck. If he had been a little closer, he might have been able to cut off its head. The 4 sharp blades made a huge wound. Only 1/3 of the neck of the quartz monster was left. Dean was surprised for a moment but quickly lifted his foot and kicked. This kick landed on the side of the beast's face. With a bang, the remaining stone on the beast's neck snapped, unable to withstand the force of this kick. Its huge head fell to the ground like a huge boulder, creating several deep holes in the ground. After rolling a few times, it stopped moving. As for the headless beast, it ran forward a few steps before losing its balance and falling forward. Dust rose. The huge quartz monster crawled on the ground and didn't move again. Dean used his X-ray vision to look at it. He saw that the heat source was quickly dissipating and the concentration was rapidly weakening. It was the appearance of death. Chapter 905. Monica was also in disbelief. She was completely dumbfounded when the head of the quartz monster fell to the ground. This was a quartz monster. It was famous for its terrifying defense. How could its head be so easily cut off by Dean? She couldn't believe it, but the giant quartz monster's head had fallen right in front of her. She had no choice but to believe it. This quartz monster's intelligence was lower than the average abyssal monsters. It simply didn't know how to fake its death and disguise itself. Moreover, through her own abilities, she could tell that this quartz monster was truly dead. Gotcha! Barkle crawled out of the soil, and the first thing he saw was the place where the quartz beast's head had fallen. When he saw the head clearly, a trace of shock flashed across his eyes. He didn't expect his senses to be right. It was no wonder that the density of the soil that the quartz beast had gathered earlier had suddenly stopped. He turned his head and looked at Dean, who was stunned in place. His eyes flickered and soon returned to normal. He sat on the ground, gasping for breath, and asked, "Did you two kill him?" Monica looked at him and curled her lip. She knew a little bit about Buck's ability. She didn't believe that he didn't know anything about the outside world during the time he was in the underground. However, she was too lazy to expose him. She didn't want to make an enemy out of him. She could only say, "It has nothing to do with me. Mr. Dean solved it by himself. If I knew that Mr. Dean was so powerful, then we wouldn't have spent so much effort." Dean came back to his senses as he heard the conversation between the two. He glanced at Baker's broken ribs. There were some doubts in his heart, but he didn't show it. He only said, "I didn't expect it to be so careless. Thanks to Miss Monica who attracted its attention. Otherwise I wouldn't have found the opportunity to attack its weakness and kill it." Mr. Dean is modest. "It's nothing. I'm just telling the truth." Buck didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he saw the two of them being modest. Don't shirk your responsibility. In any case, it was you two who killed it. Fortunately, you acted in time. Otherwise I would have suffered a big loss. The Wall Lord is strong. You would have killed it sooner or later even without us," Dean said in a comforting tone. Barker smiled and shook his head, but didn't say anything. He was analyzing Dean's words in his mind. Although he didn't directly see what happened outside, but he had a vague perception of the general situation. Dean was able to kill the quartz beast in one blow, so his strength was much stronger than he had expected. Moreover, the attack power was extremely terrifying. Otherwise, even if he used all of his strength, he wouldn't be able to cut off the head of the quartz beast. It was estimated that the sword would get stuck in the middle. From this, it could be seen that Dean's magic marks should be an extremely strong attack type. As he analyzed Dean's strength, Dean was also pondering in his heart. He felt that it was inconceivable before, but not because he felt that he had killed the quartz beast so easily. He felt that he wasn't afraid of the quartz beast from the beginning to the end. The speed of the quartz beast's attack and pursuit, as well as its power, didn't seem to be terrible to him. He felt that he could do the same. The reason why he was surprised was that he did not expect Horny and Barkle to be defeated by this thing. They were defeated so quickly that the quartz magic beast that had defeated two people in a row instantly rose a few notches in his heart, forcing him to go all out. The result was that it was so easy to kill it. He suspected that Barkle was deliberately pretending to be injured. This way, he didn't have to rush to the front, and at the same time, he and Monica, who weren't injured, could deal with the quartz monster and take the opportunity to observe their strength. Secondly, another abyss-level monster had appeared in the distance. If they were injured, then the heavy responsibility of dealing with that monster would naturally fall on them. However, he saw that Buck's injury was very serious. It would be too ruthless if he pretended to be injured. Dean thought for a moment. He felt that Buck's injury was half true and half false. In any case, his injury forced him to expose his strength. If he was pretending, then he would admit it. He couldn't be careless against these abyss-level masters. Holland should still be in its stomach. I don't know if he has digested it or not. Let's find him first, Buck said to Monica. Monica shook her head. I can't feel its existence. It's a disaster. Let's deal with that one first. I don't know how many people will be killed. Buck slightly frowned. But what she said was reasonable. He immediately looked at Dean. What do you think? Let's go and help first. Dean rushed out. He didn't stop since he had decided. Wait for us. Buck and Monica immediately caught up. Dean held Aisha in his arms and rushed to the hunting team. As he approached, he saw the shape of the monster that was surrounded by many members of the hunting team. It was a mud-like monster. Its whole body was wriggling with mud. It was about 14 or 15 meters high, like a small building. It had no head, but the mud at the top seemed to be its head. There were no facial features on it. Mud tentacles kept extending from its body and swept into the crowd. Those who couldn't escape in time were pulled back into the mud and sank into it. Then a few small bubbles appeared on the surface of the mud, and then there was no sound from it. A golden light flashed in Dean's eyes. Through his X-ray vision, he saw that the body of the person who was pulled into the monster's body was quickly pierced by the mud. The next moment, the body was torn apart, crushed by the mud, turned into blood, and mixed with the mud. After a while, the blood seemed to be absorbed by the mud and completely disappeared. The size of the mud-like monster was faintly bigger. The change was very small, but Dean noticed it. Rotten mud ghost. Buck took a deep breath. His face was a bit ugly. Dean saw that Buck recognized it and asked, "What do you mean?" "This thing is indeed an abyssal magical creature, and it's one that's very difficult to deal with. Its hunting level isn't fixed. The magical creature catalog's evaluation is based on its size and height. If it's 12 meters tall, its hunting level is 305. If it's 13 meters tall, its hunting level is 305. That's 10 levels per meter. I think it's at least 14 meters tall. Its hunting level isn't any lower than the quartz beast from before." Dean frowned as he felt that it was a bit tricky. The rotten mud ghost was different from the quartz monster. The quartz monster had a hard shell. Dean wasn't afraid of encountering a defensive monster. After all, the defense would be broken unless his physical strength was exhausted. However, the body of the rotten mud ghost was soft and sticky. He didn't need to attack to know that it was his enemy. An extremely sharp blade could cut through hardness, but it couldn't cut through water. Without the advantage of the sharp blade, the rotten mud ghost was 10 times stronger than the quartz monster. He may not be able to deal with it. I should have thought of it. The quartz monster feeds on stones. It often eats extremely precious ores. The rotten mud ghost likes the feces of the quartz monster the most. It is a great tonic for it. No wonder it appeared here. Buck was a bit annoyed. If I knew it would be like this, I would have directly retreated. Dean's eyes flashed as he said, "It's meaningless to say these things now. I don't think I can help you with this thing. I've overdrawn my physical strength after killing the quartz beast. You have seen that I'm good at attacking. But although my attack is strong, it has no effect on this thing. Look at other people's arrows. They fell into it and then bounced out. Ordinary sword wounds are useless against it." Chapter 906. All right. Dean nodded. He knew that they wouldn't be willing to fight seriously if they didn't make a move. While they were talking, more than a dozen people in the hunting group died one after another. Some were killed by the mud that splashed out from the mud ghost's body, some were killed by the mud that turned into spikes, and some were directly pulled into its mud-like body and crushed to death. Dean, Barker, and Monica quickly rushed forward. Monica went to the rear of the carrion ghost. Fine particles slowly floated out of her moth-like snow-white body. It seemed that there was something inside her body. Dean and Barker rushed to the front of the carrion ghost. Barker took the lead and stabbed the carrion ghost with his bone sword. The next moment, the carrion ghost's arm was about to be swallowed by the carrion ghost's bone sword. Baker's face changed. He pulled out the bone sword and cut the mud. However, the wound healed instantly. It was useless. Dean and Baker rushed in front of the mud ghost. Dean also stabbed into the mud. He felt that it was easy to stab into the mud, but when he wanted to pull it out, he felt that there seemed to be a corrosive force in the mud. It was digesting his sharp limbs, and the speed of digestion was very fast. Dean was shocked. He quickly pulled out the blade but saw that the color of the blade was mottled. It seemed that the color was fading unevenly. Physical damage is useless. Baker retreated to Dean's side. I remember that there are a few people in the hunting group who have magic marks. Let them attack. Maybe they can cause some damage. We will cover for them. Dean nodded slightly as he thought about the attack of the supplicant's magic mark. At this moment, the supplicant's magic mark was much more useful than his splitter. After all, it was the #1 legendary monster here. However, the cost of replacing the magic mark was huge. He needed to absorb the god's marrows and the ice worm to restore his current strength. He might not even be able to restore his current strength. Therefore, he needed to be careful when choosing the magic mark. Once he chose it, it would be difficult to replace it as he didn't have enough resources. Baker came to the edge of the encirclement. He called the 3 people with magic marks and told them his plan. Then he asked Dean to continue to rush forward. Although their attacks were ineffective, they could at least attract the attention of the sludge ghost. Dean and Barker went forward to contain and interfere with the sludge ghost. The 3 Lord of Magic marks sneakily followed behind. They aimed at the opportunity and immediately approached the sludge ghost. Dark demonized claws patted the mud body of the sludge ghost. The place where the claws were patted slightly collapsed. The color turned black as if it was corroded. Before Dean and Baker could rejoice, the mud that had sunk in quickly gushed out and restored to its original state. At the same time, several spikes protruded from the mud and shot toward the 3 rulers. Puff! One of the sovereigns couldn't react in time, and the mud spear pierced through his throat, killing him on the spot. The other 2 fled in panic, not even daring to breathe loudly. Dean's face slightly changed. The carrion ghost's hunting level was only 10 levels higher than the quartz beast, but it was several times more difficult to deal with it. If he encountered it alone, he could only escape. He was completely helpless against this thing, which made him see his weakness. Goo goo goo! Suddenly, a roar that sounded like a bucket of water came from the mud-like body. It was filled with extreme anger. Dean was stunned for a moment. He saw a figure appear behind the carrion ghost. It was Monica, but at this moment, her whole body was snow-white. When her figure fluttered, white powder constantly drifted down. It was like snowflakes, but finer and more deadly than snowflakes. The white powder fell on the carrion ghost's body, and the place that was touched quickly hardened, no longer soft and wriggling. When the white powder sprinkled on more than half of its upper body, Monica stabbed the silver sword in her hand. Crack! The mud-like body suddenly broke like a rock. Dean and Barker looked at each other. They didn't miss this rare opportunity. They quickly rushed to the place where the carrion ghost was covered by the white powder. Crack! The hardened upper body of the carrion ghost was completely twisted. After the upper body was smashed, the lower body of the carrion ghost slowly shrank. It drilled into the ground, ready to escape. Dean waved the sharp sword to cut the ground, wanting to keep the carrion ghost. But the carrion ghost's drilling speed was extremely fast, like a fish in the water. It was extremely flexible. Most likely, the carrion ghost had suddenly drilled out from the ground. Barker and Monica tried to keep the carrion ghost, but like Dean, both of them failed. After the carrion ghost drilled into the ground and escaped, the 3 of them were exhausted. Barker sat on the ground, gasping for breath. He took out medicine from his backpack and bandaged himself. At this moment, he didn't have the slightest dignity of a wall lord. Monica released the Reaper's body, and her body returned to the appearance of a human beauty. but her face and skin were a little pale. She looked at Dean but didn't say anything. She went to the side and sat quietly to rest. Dean also released the Reaper's body. The battle didn't last long, so he didn't consume a lot of energy. It was easy for him to kill the quartz monster. Although the carrion ghost was difficult to deal with, but he didn't spend much effort. Moreover, he found that the carrion ghost seemed to be the same as the carrion ghost. If its body wasn't as soft as mud, it wouldn't be difficult for him to kill the carrion ghost. He found that the attack speed of the carrion ghost wasn't fast. He was able to dodge easily. Even when he dodged Monica's white powder, the carrion ghost seemed to be a bit slow. He didn't know whether it was because the carrion ghost was slow or because its physique was higher than the average abyss monster. Other members of the hunting group were cleaning up the battlefield while Dean was analyzing the situation. They were helping the injured to heal and burying the remaining limbs and corpses on the ground. Some people proposed to cremate the corpses on the spot. This was the custom of the hunters outside the giant wall. After all, it wouldn't take long for the corpses to be picked up and eaten by a monster with a keen sense of smell. This proposal was rejected. Some people thought that the previous movement was too big. If they continued to stay here to cremate the corpses, it would be difficult to guarantee that it wouldn't attract other monsters. Moreover, the smell of the cremation process would be stronger and more likely to attract monsters. Moreover, although burying the corpses on the spot might fall into the belly of the beast, but for the living it could be used as bait to attract monsters. After a few discussions, someone looked for Barker to make a decision. Chapter 907. Dean looked at Holland and saw that his body was covered with sticky yellow liquid. It was disgusting. It seemed to be the digestive fluid from the body of the quartz monster. He said, "You didn't die?" Dean had used his X-ray vision before. Unfortunately, he couldn't penetrate the body of the quartz monster. But he didn't see any reaction from Holland's heat source. He thought that something really happened to him. "Your luck is good. The battle has just ended and you have come." Monica glanced at Holiday, not surprised that he was still alive, and said with a slight sarcasm. Holland smiled. "I was almost digested. Fortunately, you killed that thing in time. The three of you are my benefactors. This seems to be a rotten ghost. Is it dead?" "It just died," Barkley replied. He was in no mood to pay attention to him. Dean saw that Monica and Barkley weren't surprised that Holland survived. It seemed that he had underestimated the shamelessness of the abyss. Now it seemed that Holland had deliberately let the quartz monster eat him. Even if he didn't kill the quartz monster, he estimated that he wouldn't have an accident. Instead, he could take the opportunity to hide inside the body of the quartz monster and watch how they fight. After all, they lost one person. The pressure on the remaining three would be greater. Naturally, they couldn't hide their strength. Thinking of this, he glanced at Barkley. As a wall lord, he was able to suppress Monica and Holland. Barkley's ability should be a bit stronger than them, but he couldn't see how powerful he was from the previous performance. In this way, it was he and Monica who had been exposed more in this battle. However, Barker and Horney might have already known what Monica had exposed, so there was no need to hide it. From the beginning to the end, he was the one who had suffered the most. "Let's take a break and leave as soon as possible. The quartz monster is dead. There is no master in this territory. Most of the monsters will invade. It's not good to stay here for a long time." Barker bandaged the wound on his chest, patted his butt, stood up, and said to Horney, "Let your people count the losses. Many people died earlier, and we are going to face the Arctic frost dragon next. We can't afford any more losses." At the end of his sentence, there was a hint of meaning in his words. However, Horney did not seem to understand. He nodded and said, "It's time to go. You guys rest first. I'll open the way." Dean was not in the mood to wrangle, so he sat down to rest. A moment later, Serene reorganized the members of the hunting team and did a head count. In just a few minutes, the rotten mud ghost had killed 4 dominators, 9 demon generals, and more than 70 pioneers. Now, there were only about 360 people left. After reorganizing the hunting group, Serene led his men to open the way. The area of the magic pit was very large, much larger than the other areas outside. According to Serene, it was about the size of 4 giant walls. It could easily accommodate hundreds of millions of people. Dean associated this concept with a sunken island country. He knew the scope of the Devil's Pit. Although the island country had a population of more than 100 million people, but the land area was very large. In fact, it could accommodate more people. The Devil's Pit was about half the size of the island country. They were still at the edge of the Devil's Pit. The ice lake was close to the central area. It was a long way. After half a day of travel, they encountered some Dominator-level monsters. Serene took the initiative to lead the team to kill them. There were not many warriors of the hunting group. After leaving the territory of the quartz monster, they encountered 2 abyss-level monsters. However, Monica sensed them in advance and avoided them. The sky was getting dark. Everyone was resting in a canyon. The whistling wind was like a monster's grin. It made people feel uneasy. In this nervous mood, everyone was holding their weapons and sleeping. They would wake up at any time. Holland and Monica were responsible for the night watch. Originally Holland wanted to be polite, but he didn't expect Dean and Barkley to be polite. They immediately agreed. But he also knew that they were angry at him for avoiding the fight during the day, so he didn't care about anything. Moreover, even if he was asked to sleep, he didn't dare to sleep. From the battle with the quartz monster during the day, he guessed that Dean's magic mark should be a monster that was very good at fighting. It was not good at perception. It would be better to let a ruler guard the night instead of Dean. The night outside the giant wall was always long. The sound of monsters howling could be heard from time to time. Many of the more ferocious monsters liked to appear at night and hunt other monsters. The difficulty of survival was not only reflected in Dean and the other hunters. For other weaker monsters, the night was also a disaster. Most of the monsters returned to their nests at dusk. No matter how far away they were from their nests, they would rush back. The night passed quickly. Along the way, a few pioneers and a dominator monsters found the canyon, but before they could attack, they were quietly killed by Serene and Monica, who were on night watch without causing much of a commotion. When the dawn came, the dark world seemed to glow with hope again. After a night of hiding and shivering monsters, the monsters left their nests to look for their prey. Dean and the others also ate dry food, replenished water, and set off again. Under the leadership of Serene, everyone moved toward the ice lake in the depths of the Devil's Pit. With Monica, a master of perception, they avoided a lot of risks along the way. Nevertheless, they still encountered a lot of pioneer-level monsters in broad daylight. As for the weaker monsters, they would encounter them from time to time, but they were killed by the warriors of the hunting group. On the way, Dean borrowed a map from Serene and looked at it. When Serene pointed out their location on the map and the ice lake, Dean knew that they were still a long way from the ice lake. It would take at least 2 or 3 days. Marching for 2 or 3 days in the Devil's Pit was no less than suicide. Dean looked around at the warriors who were sitting on the ground to rest and massage their shoulders. There was a bit of pity in his heart. There weren't many people here who could go back alive. However, they still had hope. They thought that as long as there were several Abyss warriors, nothing would happen to them. Even if something happened, they would be the lucky ones to survive. But he knew that when they reached the ice lake, they would be the first batch of cannon fodder to rush to the front. They would wear down the power of the ice dragon and reduce the possibility of danger. Even if everyone was sacrificed, they wouldn't care. Because after getting the ice worm, Baker and the others would return to the giant wall at the fastest speed. They wouldn't stay in the Devil's Pit for a long time. After all, even the Abyss could die here. Regrettably, only he, who had reached the abyss, could understand this. Others might have guessed it, but they could only sadly accept their fate, or humble themselves with a trace of hope, begging for mercy. But the strong never show mercy. 2 days passed. Dean and Honeylay led the remaining 300 warriors of the hunting group to the ice forest outside the ice lake. In the past 2 days, they encountered 3 abyssal monsters. Although Monica and several other dominators and generals with strong perception were exploring the way, they still couldn't find the 3 abyssal monsters with strong lurking ability. The battle was inevitable. Fortunately, the abyssal monster was alone this time. Under the siege of several people, they spent a lot of effort to solve it. Dean was relatively low-key in the following battles. At the same time, he took the opportunity to observe the magic marks of Honeylay and the other 2. He even deliberately exposed flaws in the battle to give the abyssal monsters the opportunity to attack. In his observation, Honeylay was good at using poison. At the same time, he had a strong perception ability. He could release poison from his mouth and the needles in his wings. The venom was extremely corrosive and toxic. It could easily corrode metal and rock. One of the abyssal monsters was poisoned by Honeylay. Its body quickly decayed and its flesh peeled off. The scene was extremely cruel. In addition to hardening things into snow-white powder, Monica's magic marks could also bewitch the enemy and make them absent-minded. Dean deliberately made a mistake. He forced Monica to use this trick when the abyssal monster drilled out of the encirclement. Although it only stunned the abyssal monster for a moment, Dean still saw it. This made him pay special attention. This kind of ability was the most difficult to deal with. Dean didn't see much of Baker's ability. He only knew that Baker's bones healed quickly. This also convinced him that Baker deliberately injured himself in the previous battle. Moreover, he pretended to bandage his wounds. It was completely deceiving him. As Dean analyzed the abilities of the 3 in his mind, the 3 also set an impression of Dean's ability. Strong attack, sharp. No matter how strong the defense of the abyssal monster was, it was as fragile as a piece of paper under Dean's sharp blade. They tried their best to barely cause damage, but Dean's sharp blade could cut through them. This made the 3 quite afraid. Although they had their own abilities, and Dean may not be their opponent in a sneak attack, but in a head-on confrontation, Dean's ability was the most terrible. They couldn't compete with him at all. Even their weapons would be cut off. If Dean's fighting skills were high, coupled with this ability, he was simply a god of death. However, the 3 were glad that Dean's ability seemed to be relatively extreme. In addition to the sharp attack, he didn't show any other ability. Even his perception was very weak. While they were getting to know each other, they arrived at the snowy forest outside the frozen lake. It was May, and summer had just arrived, but it was still extremely cold here. The branches of the forest were covered in ice shards. Dean was surprised as he saw the snowy weather. This kind of thing was completely unscientific. It was not the North Pole where it was freezing in the summer. The climate outside the snow forest was relatively hot, but inside the forest it was like entering another world. The reason why the North Pole was frozen all year round was because it was far from the sun, but here it was not the case. Be careful. The dragon may not always stay in the ice lake. It may come to this forest to look for food. Horny reminded the hunting group. Monica looked at the snowy forest curiously and said, "Is the influence of the Arctic frost dragon so big that even this place is frozen? This dragon has lived here for a long time. It is said that it has lived here for 40 or 50 years. Barkle knew more. He said in a low voice, because of it, the surrounding monsters have all been infected with a similar ice constitution. These monsters live in this forest, which is why the temperature here is so low. Be careful." Monica suddenly understood. Dean was surprised. Had lived here for 40 or 50 years. It was almost impossible to dominate a territory outside the giant wall for 40 or 50 years. Not to mention this was the abyss. The ultra-high radiation in the abyss was constantly accelerating the mutation of the monsters. Every day there would be a new overlord being born. The resources were limited. The new overlords would compete with the old overlords for territory. The loser would be swallowed. This was the law of survival outside the giant wall. How strong was this Arctic dragon to be able to guard this place for 40 or 50 years? Chapter 908. Dean made up his mind to retreat immediately if the situation was not good. Although the ice worm was precious and the opportunity was hard to come by, but as long as there was life there was hope. At this time, Holland had organized the first batch of cannon fodder squads. They were led by 2 dominators and took the lead to enter the ice forest. How far is the distance from the forest to the ice lake? Dean asked Holland. Holland looked at the forest in front of them. It's not far if we go in a straight line. It's less than 80 miles. But if we encounter some troublesome things and need to take a detour, then it will be very troublesome. 80 miles for Dean and others wasn't much different from 800 meters in the eyes of ordinary people. But if there were snakes and dogs on the way, then most people wouldn't think that the road was short. Barker said, "Try not to take a detour. It's too dangerous to take a detour in this forest. It's best to go through as soon as possible." Holland nodded. "I know. Can't we burn the forest?" Dudian asked. The 3 of them were startled and looked at Dean strangely. How violent was his character to think of such a thing? "It's impossible to burn the forest with fire," Holland explained to Dean. "Fire is the nemesis of all things, but the temperature in the forest is low and there are a lot of monsters with ice physique. It's almost impossible to ignite the whole forest unless we bring a lot of tarpaulins. Even if we burn the forest, the monsters will rush out and it will be more dangerous for us." "That's true." Dudian nodded. He felt that this method was not appropriate. What Horny said was right. 10 minutes later, the exploration team that went deep into the forest sent back a signal that they could come in. Holland immediately organized the 2nd to 5th cannon fodder squads to enter. The 4 of them walked in the middle of the team. The rest of the warriors of the hunting group were responsible for the rear. They formed a long snake team to move forward. After coming to the forest, Dean put away his previous casual attitude and let Aisha follow him closely. He was ready to use the demonization to deal with the surprise attack. At the same time, his eyes flashed with a touch of dark gold from time to time. He used his X-ray vision to observe the surrounding environment. It didn't take long for the sound of fighting to come from the front. Everyone was shocked. Monica looked ahead and calmly said, "Don't worry, it's not the abyss." Several hunting groups around them were relieved. They felt cold sweat on their backs. Compared to the happy days inside the giant wall where there were beautiful women and fragrant wine in their hands, this place was simply a difficult hell. This is the territory of the Arctic frost dragon. There shouldn't be a second abyss dragon. Everyone, be careful and don't get ambushed by other monsters. Everyone listened to him, and their hearts were filled with confidence. Soon, the team moved faster. From time to time, there were sounds of fighting. Dean followed the team and came to the place where the sounds were coming from. He saw several bloody corpses on the ground, as well as 2 corpses of monsters that had been split into 2 halves. The monster's hair was dark blue and exuded a very heavy chill. Dean was speechless. An ice dragon was able to transform all the monsters in the territory into ice physique. This ability was beyond his imagination. Half an hour later, the group passed through the snowy forest, leaving behind the corpses of a dozen companions and a number of monsters. After coming out of the forest, they saw a vast lake not far away. The lake was quiet and the water was clear. Dudian looked at the lake and saw that it was frozen. "Get ready to draw the old dragon out." Horny looked at the huge ice lake and said. Barkle had a grave look in his eyes as he said coldly, "Let me say this first. When we attack later, if anyone tries to play tricks and doesn't go all out, don't blame me for being merciless." Horony's face slightly changed. "Naturally, Wall Lord, please rest assured." "Yes," Dean immediately said. "There are some things that everyone is well aware of. I don't want to say it too clearly. The Arctic dragon is not an ordinary abyss. If anyone tries to sneak attack me from the back, then I'll leave. I don't want the ice worm anymore." The three frowned but didn't say anything. Dean didn't pay attention to them. His words were just a warning. If the enemy wanted to sneak attack or deliberately save energy, he would be helpless. At this time, the one who was honest would suffer a loss. Dean looked at the frozen lake and used the heat source to observe. He didn't see any heat source. He looked at the three. "I'll go up and have a look." "Okay." Horony nodded and continued to command the others. Dean flew to a height of 20 or 30 meters and looked down. The frozen lake was very big. There was no wind or snow on the frozen lake, so it was as transparent as a mirror. He could see the dark green water at the bottom of the lake. I don't know if there are other fish monsters at the bottom of the lake. If not, what does it eat? The biggest problem of all life was eating and drinking, especially for some large monsters. In order to forage for food, they had to walk on the road of hunting or migration. They even had to compete with difficult hunters for food, or challenge the hegemons of other territories. Once injured, the difficulty of foraging would increase, and they would starve. The more hungry they were, the more powerless they would be, and the more hungry they would be, the more powerless they would be, and the more they would be injured, the more powerless they would be. In the world outside the giant wall, there were countless monsters dying every day. Many of these monsters were incomparably fierce. From the current situation, it was obvious that the Arctic dragon was an amphibious monster. It could even fly. Dean patrolled around the lake and soon found Messy Claw Mark. It should be left by the Arctic dragon when it came ashore to forage for food. In addition to the claw marks, he also saw some potholes and traces of fighting. He also saw half of a broken spear inserted in the side of a tree near the forest. It was covered by grass. If he didn't look down from the sky and had good eyesight, he wouldn't be able to see it. Were there humans who fought here? Dean's eyes moved, but he didn't think much about it. The ice lake was recorded on the map in Royal's hand. Naturally, it was explored by humans. He was about to land, but at this moment, at the bottom of the frozen lake, a shadow suddenly swayed. Dean thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A few seconds later, another huge shadow swayed, like a long snake. Dean's eyelids twitched. Was it the Arctic dragon? Was it at the bottom of the lake? He continued to stare at the lake for a moment. The shadow flashed again. It was a long strip. It was estimated to be more than 10 meters long. But it went back to the bottom of the lake, so he couldn't see it clearly. He watched for a moment, but the shadow did not appear again. He landed and looked at the warriors of the hunting group who had arranged themselves by the lake. He said to Horny and the other two, "Should we lure it out now? Everyone is in position." "Let's start," Holly said. Dean frowned. "Should we wait for the Arctic dragon to come out to forage for food?" Wait for it to forage for food? The three of them weren't rookies, so they knew what Dudian meant. Barker thought for a moment. When it forages, it means that it is hungry and its physical strength is the weakest. Naturally, it is the best time to make a move. However, we don't know how often it eats. These cold-blooded creatures often eat for half a month at a time. We can't wait that long for it to digest. Dean saw that they didn't know the eating pattern of the Arctic dragon. He said, "Let's get ready. I don't know if it is at the bottom of the lake or out to forage for food." Monica frowned. "If it is not at the bottom of the lake, then it will be alarmed by us. I just saw a shadow at the bottom of the lake. I don't know if it is the Arctic dragon or not. But I don't think there are any other monsters at the bottom of the lake," Dean said. Chapter 909. Brother Dew, now that things have come to this, Shouldn't your female companion lend a hand? Barker looked at Aisha, who was next to Dean. Dean hadn't let Aisha make a move along the way. They wanted to test Aisha's strength, but they were very clear that this female companion was a genuine corpse king. Her pure black pupils and thick corpse energy were by no means a disguise. How terrifying a corpse king controlled and cultivated by human beings was depended on how crazy Dean was. From Dean's several talks and moves, they knew that this young man was not an ordinary person. The female companion controlled by him might be much stronger than him. Dean's face turned cold as he heard Barker's words. I have my own judgment on whether I should let her make a move or not. Brother Dew, you can't say that. This old dragon isn't an ordinary abyss. If we don't unite now, we may not be able to defeat it. Besides, we've all contributed. Shouldn't you show us something too? Horony also said. That's right. Dean narrowed his eyes. Did the two want to force him? However, their calculations were obviously wrong. He wouldn't fall for it. What do you want me to show? Didn't I make a move along the way? Don't forget who saved your life. Don't forget who killed the quartz beast. Horony's face stiffened. He coughed and looked at Monica and Barker. His meaning was obvious. I have nothing to say. I can only leave it to you. Brother Dew, we know that you've put in a lot of effort as well. However, with just the four of us, we're the only ones who can deal with the extreme ice frost dragon. We've all put in a lot of effort for the sake of the extreme ice worm. Please understand, Baku advised. Dean couldn't help but laugh. What? My woman is an abyss, so I have to make a move? Am I not qualified to get a piece of the pie? If we were to join hands, then we would have the strength of 2 abyss levels. In that case, why do I need to share with the 3 of you? Can you come up with the strength of 2 abyss levels? To put it bluntly, I alone am qualified to share the pie. Don't tell me that the information about the ice worm belongs to you. No one knows about it. Since it has been made public, then it is meaningless. The faces of the 3 changed. They didn't expect Dean to turn hostile. But the 3 of them were experienced people, so they didn't care about Dean's attitude. Barker looked at Royal and pondered for a moment. If that's the case, then Brother Dean should ask your woman to help in case of crisis. It shouldn't be too much, right? Dudian indifferently said, Of course. But I won't help if any of you are lazy. This isn't a joke. I'll be the first to withdraw if the situation goes wrong. It's best to assign tasks to each of us. We'll work together to kill the ice dragon, and then we'll discuss how to divide the ice worm. What do you think? I think so. Monica nodded. As for the discussion that Dean had mentioned, she certainly knew what kind of discussion it was. Horny and Barker also agreed. They didn't force Dean to let Aisha take action. Horny said, I will draw out the old dragon. The 3 of you will be responsible for blocking it. Although it is difficult to draw it out, but we still need to rely on your participation in the subsequent battle. Barker said. He wouldn't be polite with Horny. Now was a critical moment, so he didn't dare to be arrogant. Horny frowned and looked unhappy. But in his heart he knew that he wouldn't let it go so easily. They discussed for a moment and finally decided on a plan. They assigned their respective tasks and responsibilities. Horny entered the demonic state after everything was ready. He flew up like a black crow and hovered in the air for a moment. Suddenly he whispered, I see it. He swooped down and raised his hand to pull the bow and arrow borrowed from the general. He aimed at the tranquil lake and shot the arrow. Whoosh! The arrow pierced through the lake and pierced into the lake. Although the penetrating power of the arrow was strong, the resistance of the water was stronger. Soon there was no sound. Dean and the others who were lying in ambush at the edge of the forest held their breath. Suddenly, a roar resounded from the ice lake and resounded for hundreds of miles. Bang! 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 The ice on the surface of the lake was completely cracked. It was like a broken mirror that fell to the ground. A black shadow was thrown out from the lake and rolled towards Horny in the air. Horny was shocked and hurriedly dodged. The black shadow swept through the air and hit the lake like a whip, stirring up thousands of waves. These waves soared into the air but turned into ice. The next moment, there was another fierce roar from the bottom of the lake. All the water droplets that were about to fall and turn into ice rushed up like sharp thorns. They were like thousands of arrows that covered most of the sky. Horony's face changed. He hurriedly used his wings to protect his body and rose higher. Even so, when the ice droplets fell on his wings, he still felt the coldness and pain. He was horrified. Although he expected that the strength of the ice dragon was extraordinary, he didn't expect it to be so terrifying. Just the ice droplets caused by the roar could hurt him. There was a trace of shock in the eyes of Dean, Barker, and Monica. Although they weren't Horony and didn't personally guard the lake, they were also experts and could see the door at a glance. This is by no means an ordinary abyss. Dean was shocked. At this time, a burst of white water suddenly shot out from the lake and hit Horony. Horony hurriedly dodged and at the same time once again increased his altitude and flew towards the lake. Roar! A dragon's roar resounded, and the lake water surged, washing the shore. In the next instant, the surface of the lake swelled up, and a gigantic silhouette soared up from the lake. In an instant, it covered the sky, and everyone felt as if the entire sky above their heads had darkened. Dean's mouth was slightly open and he was stunned. What kind of gigantic dragon was this? The dragon's wings were as huge as a sail. Its body was inclined to the structure of a western dragon, but it didn't have the feeling of a salamander. The head of its upper body was similar to that of a flood dragon. The top of its head was like a dense icicle. At this time, Dean discovered that the shadow he saw in the lake was actually the slender tail behind it. Just that tail alone was more than 10 meters long. The warriors of the hunting group were also shocked, including Monica and Barker. There was a bit of absent-mindedness in their eyes. Could this image of an ancient fiend god really match up to him? Dean's first thought was to turn around and run. Chapter 9-10. The Arctic ice dragon flew out of the lake and chased after Horany. Before Horany could fly to the shore, it had already caught up with him. From the dragon's mouth, a cloud of white mist suddenly formed on Horany's body, and the speed at which his wings flapped slowed down. Holland was shocked and anxious. The thorns on his wings protruded as he shook off the frost and swooped towards the ground. But the speed of polar ice dragon was faster. Its claws fell from the sky and caught Holland. Holland was horrified as he struggled violently. The dragon's claws shrank and made cracking sounds. Holland's mouth overflowed with blood. "Save me! I can't hold it anymore." Dean and others who were ambushing in the forest were stunned by the scene. There was a trace of hesitation in Dean's eyes when he heard Holland's roar. He could see that Holland wasn't pretending this time. He was really panicking. The reason why he hesitated was that he was worried about the polar ice dragon. It took only a few seconds for Holland to capture Holland. He may not be able to resist such a force. At this time, his heart was beating the drums of retreat. Although it sounded ridiculous, but the fact was that he was not a rookie. He could see the power of the polar ice dragon at a glance. It would be difficult to deal with it by relying on the few of them, let alone kill it, unless Baker and others had hidden strength beyond their imagination. While he was hesitating, Monica hurriedly whispered, "Let's restrain it. We can't wait any longer, or something will really happen to him." Baker's face was dignified. No one knew what he was thinking. After Monica finished, he looked at Dean. "What do you think?" Dean's heart moved as he looked at Baker. When he saw the indifference in Baker's eyes, he suddenly understood that the relationship between the Wall Lord and Holland and Monica wasn't as intimate as before. They were not in the same camp. Although he didn't say it, but Dean could see that he wanted to give up on Holland or continue to wait to force out Holland's cards. Monica saw that Dean and Barker didn't say anything. She immediately understood their thoughts. Her face slightly changed, but she didn't say anything. She looked up at Horny, who was caught in the claws of the ice dragon. Her eyes were deep. Horny roared twice, but there was no movement from the edge of the forest. Even his own guards didn't respond. His heart was angry, but at the same time, he was a bit cold. He no longer expected Dean to help him. When the cold from the dragon claw spread to his whole body, he fiercely clenched his teeth. A large amount of black mucus oozed out from the roots of the wings. It looked like a lot of black sweat. More and more mucus gushed out and stuck to the dragon claws. Suddenly, black smoke rose from the dragon claws that were as clear as ice. The next moment, Horny roared and broke free from the dragon claws. As soon as he broke free from the dragon's claws, he rushed into the forest. The previous black mucus seemed to be poisonous gas. As soon as it appeared, there was a strange smell in the air, which made his head a little dizzy. It seemed that this was one of Royal's cards. Although he knew that Royal was good at using poison, he did not expect the toxicity to be so terrible. Just smelling the smell would make him uncomfortable. It should be known that Royal's ability to resist poison was not weak. Most of the other pioneers would feel uncomfortable after smelling this smell. Roar. The polar ice dragon seemed to be angry. A large amount of cold air came out of its palm and froze the black mucus. It twisted its body and chased after Holland again. Holland rushed straight into the forest, followed by the polar ice dragon. When its head reached the edge of the forest, suddenly a burst of fire shot out from the sand and instantly enveloped the polar ice dragon like a sea of fire. It was the warriors of the hunting group who were lying in ambush at the edge of the forest. At the same time, hundreds of flaming arrows were launched in the forest. The fire cut through the air and hit the polar ice dragon's head and wings, making tinkling sounds. The fire arrows bounced off as if they hit metal. Some fell on the leaves of the forest and were immediately ignited. Dean, Monica, and Barker, who were hiding behind the tree, immediately launched into action. Now that Holland's task was completed, it was their turn to make a move. Whoosh! Whoosh! Monica and Barker were the first to rush out. Monica entered her demon form, and her skin turned snow-white. White powder fell from her body and wings. The powder did not fall. Under the control of her wings, the wind blew onto the Arctic frost dragon's head and claws. Barker, on the other hand, rushed in front of the Arctic frost dragon and slashed at its claws with his bone sword. With a swoosh, the bone sword left a shallow mark on the dragon's claw. The huge recoil caused Baker's wrist to hurt. His pupils constricted slightly. It was only at this moment that he clearly realized that this Arctic frost dragon was even more terrifying than he had expected. Roar! The polar ice dragon roared and waved its claws towards Barker. Barker hurriedly dodged and avoided the dragon's claws. Dean had already rushed out and appeared at the side of the polar ice dragon. He quickly entered the demonic state and slashed towards the side of the polar ice dragon's abdomen. Ice Dragon, who was about to attack Baker, suddenly retracted its hand. It flapped its wings and soared into the sky. At the same time, it issued a loud and clear roar. It looked down at Dean. Its dark blue eyes were full of mania. It opened its mouth and spat out a large amount of cold air. Dean was startled as he didn't expect the polar ice dragon to dodge his attack. He felt that the polar ice dragon's mood had suddenly become intense. It seemed that it was angered. He didn't dare to face the white frost and quickly descended. Damn! Barker's face turned ugly as he saw that Dean's sneak attack failed. He looked at Monica. It seems that your trick didn't work. Call Holland over. The three of us will contain it. Let Dean attack alone. Their previous plan was that Dean would attack while they would contain the polar ice dragon. After all, Dean's attack ability was stronger than any of them. Monica's ability was biased towards perception. Although her attack wasn't weak and her means were somewhat strange, her frontal attack was far from being able to hurt the polar ice dragon's life even if it was motionless and let her attack. Monica took a deep breath. She knew that it was time to take out her cards. Otherwise she wouldn't be able to play any role in this battle. She was about to attack again when the polar ice dragon's roar echoed from the sky. The next moment the polar ice dragon swooped down and chased after Dean. Dean's face changed as he rushed to the side of Barker and others. Barker quickly leaped into the air and swung his bone sword at the Arctic frost dragon's claw. However, the Arctic frost dragon was much more violent than before. With a swipe of its claw, it slammed Barker into the ground at lightning speed, creating a deep crater. The polar ice dragon didn't look at him as it continued to chase after Dean. Dean was confused as he saw the situation behind him. He felt that the polar ice dragon was staring at him. "I haven't met you yet. Why are you so vengeful?" He couldn't help but curse in his heart. But his feet didn't stop as he ran towards Holland, who was resting on the branches of the forest. Holland's face turned black as he saw Dean rush towards him. He wanted to rest for a while. He wanted to force Dean and others to use their cards. The previous operation was beyond his expectations. He thought that he could smoothly lead the polar ice dragon to the edge of the forest and fall into the ambush. But the result was that he almost fell into the trap. The strength of the polar ice dragon was much stronger than he had imagined. It was by no means a level 372 monster. "Help me contain it," Dean shouted as he saw Holland. Holland's mouth twitched, but he still got up and flew towards the polar ice dragon behind Dean. Roar! The polar ice dragon seemed to feel the threat as it saw Holland rushing towards it. But it refused to stop and madly issued a high-pitched roar. The leaves rustled, and the next moment, the Arctic ice dragon opened its mouth and spat out a cloud of snow-white cold air. Horny, who bore the brunt of the attack, changed his expression and quickly dodged. Chapter 9:11. Dean felt that the temperature in the air suddenly dropped. It was obviously the hot early summer, but there was a feeling of 3 feet of ice. The cold air on his right hand seemed to be ready to move. A wisp of cold air flowed into his body along his blood, making him shiver with cold. Polar ice dragon chased after Horny and chased after Dean. Dean was so angry that he turned around and ran away. Holland was relieved to see that polar ice dragon didn't chase him. At the same time, he looked at the dragon who was chasing after Dean. He didn't seem to have missed anything. It was reasonable to say that Dean didn't hurt the old dragon. So why was it chasing after Dean? At this time, Monica and Barker caught up. Seeing that Horny was still on the tree, Barker looked sullen and said, "Why aren't you making a move? This old dragon's scales are too thick. Only he can hurt it. If something happens to him, this operation will fail. I don't know what he did to anger it. I think we need to change our plan now. Since this old dragon wants to kill him regardless of anything, we'll let him lure it, and we'll attack. I don't believe that with the strength of the 3 of us, we can't hurt it. If that's the case, we'd better retreat." Horny came back to his senses, looked at him, frowned and said, "It's not that I don't want to help, but I can't stop it even if I do. It's determined to kill him, and I don't know what he did to anger it." Baker was startled. His eyes flashed as he saw the dragon chasing after Dean. "All right, let's go." "Don't worry, he should be fine for a while," Holland suddenly said. Baker looked at him. "What do you mean? Didn't you see that the undead he controlled hasn't acted yet? It shows that this guy still has some strength left. He hasn't reached the point where he needs our help. I'd like to see what else he's hiding. This is a good opportunity." Horny licked his lips and a cold light flashed in his eyes. Barker understood and fell silent. "I think we should catch up to him as soon as possible. Although he is young, he is not someone to be trifled with. If we force him into a corner and he decides to walk away like he said, our losses will be too great," Monica said immediately when she saw that the 2 of them were prepared to wait for him. Barker's heart trembled, and he immediately said, "That's right, that kid might really do it. Let's chase after him." Horny slightly frowned. He wanted to say something but held back. He didn't know Dudien's character. In case Dudien really withdrew, then they would be embarrassed. If they withdrew, then they would lose a lot of people in vain. Even some of them would die on the way back. The three of them quickly caught up, but the distance between them and Dean was getting farther and farther. The three of them tried their best to catch up, but the distance between them wasn't shortened. The three of them were shocked when they saw that the dragon was 4 or 5 miles away from them. It was too fast. They could understand why the dragon was fast, but the dragon was chasing Dean. It didn't look back or even stop. It meant that it hadn't caught up yet. It also showed that Dean was faster than Polar Ice Dragon. Dean didn't think that he was fast. At the moment he wanted to grow more legs or eat more pairs of wings. He was too slow. He felt that he had exhausted all his strength, but the dragon was still chasing after him. It was like a 100-meter race. He could accelerate in a short time, but it wouldn't last long. He was hoping that the dragon would exhaust its stamina earlier. However, his expectations were disappointed again and again. He felt that his feet and wings were heavy like lead. The ground under his feet was pulling his feet. When a person felt tired, the body would slow down. It was like triggering a self-protection mechanism. But humans had another layer of protection mechanism, and that was the fear of death. Dean didn't want to die, so although he was tired, he still ran fast. He gritted his teeth again and again, increasing his speed again and again. He glanced back with the corner of his eyes. The huge shadow was always hanging over his head, and the cold air was sweeping from behind. It seemed that if he was a little late, he would be drowned by the snowstorm. He saw Bach and the other two chasing after the Arctic frost dragon, but they were too far away, so far that he wanted nothing more than to turn around and beat them up. He did not expect that the three of them would actually work together to set him up. He had already noticed them when the three of them were discussing on the tree branch. Now that they were leisurely following behind him, it was obvious that they wanted to see him forced into a corner. Dean clenched his teeth as an idea came to his mind. He slowed down his speed while paying attention to the dragon behind him. The dragon opened its mouth and spat out a mouthful of cold air as he slowed down his speed. Dean hurriedly dodged and went to the other side. Arctic frost dragon's neck was very long, and as it moved its neck, a constant wave of cold air swept across the area. Everywhere it passed, the trees were all frozen, including the venomous snakes and strange insects that were hidden in the trees. Dean continued to run in circles. He found that the ice dragon's body would pause when it was spitting out cold air. Although it was still flying forward, but the speed was very slow. He didn't know if it was to control the cold air it was spitting out. The cold air swept around but didn't touch Dean. The dragon roared and rushed towards Dean. Dean hurriedly jumped down from the tree branch and landed on the forest ground. He turned and ran. Bang! Bang! The sound of trees breaking echoed. The wings of the dragon were like two huge metal knives that destroyed all the trees. The dragon's claws fell from the sky towards Dean. Dean's face changed as he rushed forward for 20 or 30 meters. He felt the ground shake behind him. It was the sound of the dragon's claws hitting the ground. He turned around and rushed towards Royal and others. The three of them saw the direction Dean was running in. They knew what Dean was thinking. They cursed in their hearts but still rushed forward. "Hurry up!" Dean shouted as he sprinted again. Roar! The Arctic frost dragon landed in the middle of the forest and strode forward, causing the forest to rumble with every step. The monsters that were hiding in the forest all scattered in all directions. There were no zombies here, and any monster could feel the terrifying aura of the Arctic ice dragon. Holland was flying a little faster than Monica and Barker. He looked at Dudien, who was running towards him. He was about to open his mouth, but Dudien didn't seem to see him. He ran straight past him and headed towards the lake. Royal's face darkened. The next moment his whole figure was shrouded in shadow. The dragon looked at the three people in front of it. It looked up to the sky and roared. A large amount of cold air appeared on its scales. Buck's eyes narrowed as he pulled out his sword. Amidst the hazy cold air, countless ice arrows suddenly shot out in all directions. The three's expressions changed, and they hurriedly brandished their weapons to block the ice arrows. However, the strength of the ice arrows was too great, and after continuously blocking them, the weapons in their hands were frozen by the ice arrows, and there were even traces of cracks appearing. "Damn! We can't stop it." Horny gritted his teeth as he glanced at Dean. He was so angry that he almost died. He saw that Dean had already disappeared. He didn't have any intention to attack the ice dragon. Barker waved his bone sword in a circle, but he still missed a few ice arrows and was stabbed in the shoulder. He pulled the sword out with a backhand, but there was no blood on the wound. His face was solemn as he shouted, "Let's retreat to the lake first and let the hunting team exhaust the enemies. It's too difficult for the three of us." Haleni could not wait for him to say that, so he immediately turned around and ran. Roar! At this moment the Arctic ice dragon, whose entire body was shrouded in ice fog, let out a long roar. With a swoosh, dozens of sharp ice thorns shot out from the ice fog. They swept over like vines and instantly arrived in front of Horny. Horny's pupils shrank and his body hurriedly dodged, but there were too many ice thorns. He dodged 4, but was pierced in the chest by the 5th, and his whole body was nailed to the forest. Not good! Buck's face changed as he quickly retreated. The swarming icicles seemed to be too far away and stopped in front of Barkle. The next moment the ice mist slowly dissipated, and the figure of the Arctic frost dragon appeared once again. As soon as it appeared, Barkle and Monica were stunned, and their faces instantly turned pale. At this moment, Arctic frost dragon's appearance had changed greatly. Although its body still retained its dragon form, snake-like ice tentacles had grown all over its body. They were wriggling softly like fur. Whoosh! Buck came back to his senses. He turned around and ran away without looking back. Monica heard the commotion and woke up with a start. She quickly ran behind Buckle. The dragon's roar came from behind again. Buck looked back and saw that the ice thorn that had nailed Royal to the ground had been lifted. It had actually pierced through Royal's body. At this moment, his chest was completely pierced. No matter what abilities he had, such an injury was enough to seriously injure him. When the ice thorn was lifted, Royal struggled violently and suddenly waved his weapon to cut it off. The next moment, his body fell along with the half of the ice thorn that had pierced through his body. But before he landed, more than a dozen ice thorns attacked him again. They intertwined with each other like sea urchins. At the place where the ice thorns intertwined, Royal's body was completely pierced through, and he was completely silent. Barker and Monica both saw this scene. The two of them couldn't believe it, and at the same time, they were a little frightened. Just by using ice, Horny was killed. This time, they knew that Horny wasn't acting. He was really dead. After all, even his head had been pierced through. There was no possibility of him surviving. Horny most likely still had some hidden cards, but it was a pity that he didn't have time to use them. Chapter 9:12. Dean noticed the situation in the rear. His heart turned cold as he saw Holland was killed by the dragon. How long has it been since they lost a member of the Abyss team? So far they haven't even confronted the dragon. Run. Dean didn't have the idea of killing the dragon to find the ice worm. The price to pay was too high. Not only he would die, but Aisha would also have an accident. He didn't want to take the risk. Baker and Monica woke up as Dean ran at full speed. They looked at the dragon and the ice thorns that were continuously protruding from the ground. Although they were barely able to keep calm, but there was a trace of panic in their eyes. The dragon was too strong. They couldn't get close to it. Now it could control the cold air to turn into ice and attack from a distance. The key point was that its speed was very fast. Their eyes could barely catch the shadow of the ice thorns. It didn't take long for Dean to reach the lake. He looked at the people of the hunting group who were lying in ambush. They probably didn't know that Holland was dead, but some of them seemed to have sensed something. Dean stopped and called Aisha to his side. He turned to look at Baker and Monica, who were running at full speed. The ice blades were continuously shooting from behind and the huge body of the dragon. He took a deep breath and shouted, "Come here and fight back." Baker and Monica were busy avoiding the ice dragon's blade. Both of them looked at each other as they heard Dean's words. They were almost distracted and got hit by the ice dragon's blades. Dean looked at the two rushing over. His eyes flashed a trace of coldness. He stamped his feet and went to meet them. At the same time, he shouted, "Get ready to fight back." Barker and Monica were shocked. They didn't know where Dean got the courage to fight back. The strength revealed by the ice dragon wasn't of the abyss level. The evaluation of the monster Atlas was wrong. They were barely able to escape with their lives. But they didn't stop Dean as they saw him rushing towards them. As the three of them approached, Barkle's body slightly leaned to the side, as if he was about to turn around. But the moment Dean got close, he suddenly backhanded his sword and stabbed at Dean, who was chasing after him. "Brat, don't blame me." Baker's heart was cold. But a crisp sound interrupted his thoughts. There was a trace of astonishment in his eyes. He saw that the bone sword in his hand was blocked by Dean's sharp blade. How? Baker felt incredible. How could he defend against the speed and suddenness of the sword? Could it be? He suddenly understood. He was glad but also angry. At the same time, he felt a trace of fear. Dean's feelings were similar to Barker's. He didn't expect his sneak attack to be blocked. After a moment of astonishment, he understood. Then all the sharp blades on his body shot out like a hedgehog. Buckle was shocked and infuriated. He spun his bone sword, wanting to parry, but after a few clanging sounds, his bone sword was broken. This bone sword was the toughest material he had ever manifested after his demonization, but it was actually broken just like that. The sword was broken, and he couldn't resist Dean's other sharp blade attacks. His body was pierced by more than a dozen holes, and his arm was cut off. All of this happened in an instant. Monica saw it. She even thought of a sneak attack, but she didn't have the time to do it. She was shocked when she saw that Baker was defeated and seriously injured in an instant. Although she knew that Dean was very good at attacking and his body was extremely sharp, she didn't expect that the mysterious Baker would be defeated in one move. It must be known that this moment couldn't be delayed. Polar Ice Dragon was chasing after him. It was imminent. No matter what cards Baker had, this moment of defeat was fatal. After Dean attacked, he kicked Baker's chest and flew backward. At this moment, he couldn't continue to attack Monica. If the sneak attack on Baker was successful, then he would have the opportunity to attack again. But now Monica was on guard against him. If they continued to fight, then all three of them would become Polar Ice Dragon's meal. As he retreated, he controlled Aisha to turn around and fly to the other side of the lake at full speed. Baker's body flew backward. His face was extremely ugly. The injuries on his body healed quickly. This was his core ability, rapid regeneration. His biggest card was Immortal Body. The Immortal Body wasn't really immortal. Barkle wasn't afraid to deal with someone like Dean who had a strong physical destructive ability. No matter how his body was damaged, he could heal. Even if his skull was pierced or his heart was pierced, he could come back to life and recover. His demonic body was beyond the scope of human life. His brain wasn't the core that dominated his body. His heart wasn't the same. Instead, the bones of his body were the core of his body. He didn't care about fighting other abyss creatures as long as they didn't have corrosive abilities. His life-saving ability could be regarded as the top in the abyss. However, no matter how many times he could heal, it would be meaningless under the cold attack of Polar Ice Dragon. Ice and fire were polar opposites. Fire was the nemesis of all things, and so was ice. He controlled the bone wings to stabilize his body, but the cold air coming from his back made his body slowly stiffen. Even his mind slowly stiffened. Only the terrifying thought of death was left in his mind. At this moment, he suddenly became no different from an ordinary person. In the face of death, it seemed that no one was an exception. Strong cold air spread out, and Baker's body quickly froze. His bone wings could no longer flap, and his body slowly fell to the ground. His feet broke into several pieces of ice. Monica, who was running at full speed towards the lake, was shocked and sad when she saw Baker's miserable state. She didn't expect that the target of the long-planned hunt would be her. Monica quickly flew to the lake, but Polar Ice Dragon followed closely behind. The hunting group that was lying in ambush by the lake immediately rushed out from the soil and under the leaves of the forest. They were like a group of moths flying into a flame, rushing towards Polar Ice Dragon. Their figures were majestic and fearless. Their demonic bodies were strange, ferocious, and seemed to be full of power. Some of them had strange shapes and seemed to have magical abilities. But the moment they got close to Polar Ice Dragon, the cold air spread out from the scales of Polar Ice Dragon like a small hurricane. Then everyone was like fallen leaves in the autumn wind. They fell to the ground one after another and turned into ice sculptures. Their expressions were lifelike. Some were screaming, some were panic-stricken, some were stunned, and some were desperate. Chapter 9:13. Monica's face turned ugly as she saw the warriors of the hunting group fall one after another. She had some expectations for the human wave tactic, but it was completely ineffective. Although she knew that the human wave tactic was useless in the face of a real monster, but the warriors of the hunting group were not ordinary soldiers. The weakest of them was at the level of 10,000 killer. Moreover, there was a dominator leading them. Even if they were surrounded by so many people, they may not be able to escape. But the strength of the Arctic dragon was beyond her expectations, and its ability just happened to restrain the crowd tactics. In addition, Horny was dead, and Barker was frozen into an ice sculpture. The only ones left were her, Dean, and the Corpse King under Dean's control. Now that things had come to this, she naturally wouldn't seek cooperation with Dean anymore. Previously, Dean had taken the risk to counterattack and forced Baker into a desperate situation. She felt that if Baker didn't have the same thoughts, she would have been the next target after Dean's sneak attack was sure to succeed. The reason why Dean took the opportunity to get rid of them was obvious. His purpose was the power within the giant wall. If she and Holland were to die, then no one in the giant wall would be able to match Dean. She didn't know how many years would pass before the kingdom of God would know about Baker's death. Her first thought was to rush back to the giant wall. She didn't have any extravagant hope for Arctic Worm. She only hoped that she could return to the giant wall first and stabilize the situation. Then she could cooperate with the temple to resist Dean's invasion. Thinking of this, her figure flew over the lake and looked at the back of Dean and Aisha. Her eyes flashed, and she suddenly turned around and flew away. While Monica was flying in the other direction, Arctic Dragon rushed out of the encirclement of the warriors of the hunting group. It roared angrily and soared into the sky. Its huge wings turned into a shadow that swept across the lake like a pair of scissors. It didn't chase after Monica, but went in the direction of Dean, who had already disappeared. Behind the Arctic Dragon, the remaining warriors of the hunting group held their weapons and stayed where they were, not daring to chase after it. The ground around them was littered with broken ice and corpses. They were the companions they had been chatting with before, but in the blink of an eye, they were separated by life and death. Although the warriors of the hunting party had slow reactions, they knew by now that the so-called encirclement was a complete joke. From the very beginning, they had been hunted down and slaughtered by the Arctic Frost Dragon. The few Abyss warriors that they had pinned their hopes on had not been able to do anything at all. All they cared about was running for their lives. When Monica's figure completely disappeared into the forest, everyone knew that they had been abandoned. Everyone's expressions were miserable. Some were resentful, some were in despair, some were in tears, and some knelt on the ground and begged. In the depths of the Devil Abyss, they did not have the protection of the abyss. Staying here meant death, and returning also meant death. Dean and Aisha quickly moved forward in the snow forest. Along the way, they met a lot of monsters with ice physique. These monsters didn't emit any heat source. They were integrated with the forest. When Dean got close, some monsters would attack him. But before they could touch Dean, they would be pierced by his sharp limbs or directly cut into two halves. Dean's face slightly changed. He used the horn on the top of his head to look back. He saw the huge body of the Arctic dragon flying in the air. The trees in the forest along the way were bent by the strong wind. The dragon's roar was mixed with anger and murderous intent. Dean could clearly feel the killing intent of the old dragon. Dean wasn't aware of it when it chased him for the first and second time. But now the Arctic dragon was relentlessly chasing him. It completely ignored the others as if it had a deep hatred towards him. He could basically guess the reason why it was attracted to him. In addition to the difference between the magic marks and the other three, there was only one difference. He had the flesh and blood of origami in his body. Although he couldn't control this power, but the light golden color of the demon's blade was enough to show that the power of the origami had penetrated into every part of his body. He knew that the origami was guarding the giant wall, which had a deterrent effect on the abyss. At the same time, the flesh and blood of the origami would also attract some powerful monsters. These monsters didn't know the horror of the flesh and blood of the origami, so they would be attracted to it. It was very likely that the Arctic dragon was attracted by the smell of the flesh and blood of origami. Dean was depressed and powerless. He couldn't cover up or get rid of the flesh and blood of origami in his body. It meant that he would be chased by the Arctic dragon until it didn't want to chase him anymore. But where was the bottom line of the dragon? Dean desperately ran out of the forest. He only hoped that it would stop after he got out of the forest. The dragon's roar was getting closer and closer. It seemed that it was above Dean's head. The sound shocked the surroundings. All the monsters in the nearby forest fled. It saved Dean a lot of trouble. Dean felt the light above his head dimmed. He looked up and saw that the Arctic dragon had caught up to him. Dean's face changed. He used all his strength to run but still couldn't change the fact that the distance between them was getting closer. The Arctic dragon was faster than before. Roar! A dragon's roar rang out as the Arctic ice dragon opened its mouth and spat out a cloud of frigid air. Dean's pupils shrank. The range of the cold air was too wide. He quickly braked, but it was too late to escape. The cold air could freeze Baker, so naturally it could also freeze him. Once he was frozen, then he would be completely finished. Aisha! Dean clenched his teeth and quickly shook the bell. The bell rang at a very high frequency. Aisha, who had been silently following behind Dean, suddenly had a trace of bloodthirst in her eyes. The veil on her cheeks fluttered without any wind. Her body changed rapidly, and the bones in her whole body made cracking sound. In the blink of an eye, she turned into a dragon-shaped monster. Her whole body was covered with flame-like red scales, and white spikes protruded from her spine. Her beautiful cheeks were covered with dragon scales and veins. She raised her head to look at the cold air descending from the sky, only to see that the snow-white trees were touched by the cold air, immediately making cracking sounds as they froze. Under the strong wind caused by the flapping of the dragon wings, some of the tree tips were broken and fell into pieces of ice. Roar! Aisha roared at the sky. Her voice was hoarse. It was somewhat similar to the roar of the Arctic dragon. A thick red light emerged from Aisha's chest to her neck. It seemed to contain a flame. She opened her mouth and spat out a magma-like flame towards the cold air. In an instant, the cold air was pierced and the flame was quickly annihilated. Chapter 9:14. As soon as he rushed out of the hole, he saw the mouth of the ice dragon pouncing towards him. Dean's pupils shrank. He twisted his wings and forcefully changed the trajectory of the ice dragon. He narrowly avoided the mouth of the ice dragon. Dean's sharp limbs were like dozens of black soft swords stabbing towards the dragon's neck. There was a ripping sound as the unstoppable sharp limb cut into the dragon's neck for less than half a meter before its momentum was greatly reduced. It was like a normal sword that had been cut into gravel and mud. It could only cut half a meter into the dragon's neck before it could go any further. It could only make use of the Arctic frost dragon's gliding momentum to slash sideways, leaving a dozen wounds on its body. Roar! The dragon roared angrily as it flapped its wings towards Dean. At the same time, it twisted its huge body and turned around to attack Dean again. Dean couldn't let Aisha preserve her strength anymore. Otherwise, both of them might die here. He released the control over Aisha and let her fall into a bloodthirsty fighting state. Roar! The same roar came out of Aisha's mouth. The scales and claws on her body rose by several inches. The scales on her chest and neck were burning with flames. The flames were getting stronger and stronger. It seemed that the scales couldn't suppress it anymore. The next moment, her whole body was burning with flames. She turned into a burning dragon woman. In the burning state, she rushed toward the dozen wounds on the dragon's neck. Her sharp claws instantly clasped the dragon's neck. She opened her mouth, revealing her originally white teeth at the moment. Her beautiful face became extremely hideous and even ugly. When she opened her mouth, there seemed to be flames spewing out from the depths of her throat. The next moment, she bit the dragon's neck wound. Arctic dragon seemed to feel the terror and threat. Its roar became more urgent and angry. But its body was too big, so it couldn't avoid Aisha, who had grabbed its neck. It couldn't twist its head to bite Aisha until Aisha bit it. Blazing flames overflowed from Aisha's mouth. The flames spread along the place where Aisha had bitten. It was like magma and blood as it tyrannically poured into Arctic dragon's neck. The ice-like neck was dyed red. The flames spread further and further before bursting out. Bang! Aisha was pushed away by the explosion, and Dean was also sent flying. Dean desperately tried to stabilize his body as he flew backward, so as not to touch the cold air that pervaded the surroundings. But at this moment, his eyes were sad and even painful. He didn't want to let Aisha participate in the battle because he didn't want to see her pure and flawless face like an angel showing such a bloodthirsty expression. But the reality always forced him to struggle at death's door again and humbly seek survival. Aisha fell into the cold air. But her body wasn't frozen. Instead, the cold air washed out a passage. By the time she fell to the ground, she had mitigated the impact to the minimum. She rolled and landed on the ground. Her toes touched the ground and once again rushed towards the dragon like an arrow from the bow. A large amount of cold air was emitted from the dragon's neck. It twisted its head and looked at Aisha, who was flying towards it again. It roared and spat out a rain of icicles towards Aisha. Aisha waved her dragon claws and used a set of extremely complex and high fighting skills. But she still couldn't avoid all the ice cones. Her body was stabbed one after another. The ice cones were strong and broke the hard dragon scales outside her body. But before they could stab deeper, they were melted by the flames on her body surface. Then they spread like steam. It seemed that her whole body was bathed in fire, but she was shrouded in hot steam. She was still fearless as she rushed forward. Dean was always paying attention to Aisha's safety. But soon he found that her performance was a bit strange. Compared to the past when she fought by instinct, now she was using skills. Whether it was aiming at the wound or the flame attack, it was purposeful. Did she know that the flame attack would cause additional damage to the dragon? If so, didn't it mean that she had wisdom? Was it the recovery of the past memories or the evolution of intelligence? Dean's face changed. Although he didn't want to admit that Aisha was a corpse king, but the fact couldn't be changed. He had to face the fact if he wanted to cure Aisha. Since it was a fact, he had to consider the changes of the Corpse King. Generally, the Corpse King would eventually evolve intelligence. No one knew whether it was the recovery of the past memories or the growth of a new species. Dean was attracted by the changes of Aisha. Aisha and the dragon were fighting again. Aisha was like a newborn dragon. She was roaring and fighting with the dragon. She was like a new warrior challenging the king of the old generation. The dragon roared again and again but couldn't do anything to Aisha. Instead, Aisha cut several wounds on its body which couldn't be healed. Dean quickly sobered up and immediately joined the battle. He quietly flew from the side while Aisha was restraining the dragon from the front. He circled around the dragon's tail. His sharp limbs rotated like a fan blade. The friction made a sharp sound as he suddenly waved it down. Several sharp limbs stacked together and slashed at the same spot, instantly sinking into the root of the Arctic frost dragon's tail, creating a huge wound. The tail was almost completely severed from the root. Ice Dragon had noticed Dean, but it didn't have time to pay attention to him. It was only when the tail was hit that it turned around and spat out ice thorns towards Dean. Dean's whole body was covered with sharp blades. It seemed that there were countless swords parrying the ice thorns, blocking them, splitting them, or flicking them away. But the impact of the ice thorns was extremely strong. Each ice thorn was like a boxer's fist, fiercely hitting his body. His body was hit by 2 ice thorns and pierced into his body. The cold spread in an instant, almost freezing his body. Dean didn't dare to face the attack again, so he moved sideways to escape. At this time, Aisha saw the opportunity and pounced on the abdomen of Arctic Dragon. Her dragon claws clasped on its snow-white belly, and the flaming claws dug deep. She opened her mouth to bite, and the sharp blades on her back were erected. Dragon scales grew on her wings, and they were all vertical, making the wingtips as sharp as a sharp knife. With flames, she stabbed towards the abdomen of Arctic Dragon. Arctic Dragon looked up and roared in pain. Its claws patted Aisha's body. Aisha slammed into the ground like a meteorite, knocking down a tree. Dean's eyes turned red as he roared and rushed towards the dragon. He used all his swords to cut the dragon's tail and spine. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of fine wounds were left on the dragon's body. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.